Andrew Doyle.
Benjamin Boyce, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, sir?
I'm all right. That's are those relics on the back of your?
Relics? Yeah, I
Yeah,
have the shriveled testicle of a Latin saint.
yeah. The index
And
finger of Saint Stanislas.
yeah,
Yeah.
and some Civil War memorabilia,
Interesting.
ashes of dead presidents.
Yeah, you've poped. You've poped. You've gone Catholic.
Oh, yeah. I kind of want to on some level, but I never
Wow.
get around to it.
We'll
What's
get
up with your background? That's very neo, modern,
what like the Matrix.
modernist.
No, it's not. It's just a screen I got from IKEA. You wouldn't
Yeah.
believe the carnage that's going on behind there. So I thought I
Oh,
would
geez.
share you from that.
Are you guys in the middle of some remodel or something, or butchery?
Not at all. Not at all. It's actually what this is just a because it's a big open plan studio. This is just a way for me to cordon off an area where I can write and I can give the illusion that I've got privacy. That's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, mental.
exactly. So
Yeah.
it kind of works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you writing nowadays?
I've just finished a new book.
Oh,
Well, I've been
again?
yeah, but I've actually finished the final proof of the book, so it's now ready to go to print. But I finished it towards the end of last year, and of course, inevitably, because it's about the end of woke, things keep changing so rapidly. Um, Trump with everything he did in January. I then had to rewrite the whole opening of the book. I've had to go through, and of course, that has a knock-on effect for absolutely everything. So, especially because so they want to put it out end of May, so it's it's very quick turnaround. So I've had to do a lot of rewrites on that, but it's there now. And if things keep changing, I'm just going to ignore them. And I think you have to accept at some point the book was written when it was written. You can't anticipate what's going to happen.
It's odd for an era to end in the middle of a decade.
Isn't it? It's not convenient. You want to think in decimal terms, generally speaking.
It's true. Yeah.
We are 10-fingered beasts. That's how we think. We celebrate the 30th birthday, not the 32nd.
No.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're a Christian. Jesus died when he was 32, I think.
He was 33.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Get it right. If you're going to be Catholic, you've got to get these details right. We're all about the details.
Look at you correcting me. I was thinking what we're going to talk about, and I remember something about your Catholic inception.
You want to talk about
beginnings.
the convent school I went to? You want to talk about that kind of... You want to do all of that? No. I mean, I can if you want.
No, but you're not interested in that. Weren't you born of a nun?
Yes, my mother was a postulant nun, but
Postulant.
not while I was born. She left the convent before I was born. You can't do those things. The Catholic Church frowns upon reproduction when you're a bride of Christ. Yeah. So that was she was a nun in Athlone, which is, if you look at a map of Ireland, is right smack in the middle of there. And I've seen old photographs of her in the habit. The postulants wear the old habit. She was only sort of 18. And so, that's her background. But I went to a convent school. My convent school was called Our Lady of Compassion. That's about as Catholic a name as you could get. It'd be like calling it Mary Chastity Blood or something, something really, extreme. With actual nuns. My headmistress was a nun called Sister Hilda, who was a terrifying woman, or at least I thought she was terrifying, because adults for a 4-year-old are like these mysterious red-faced giants. And she beat me very ferociously with a shoe because I broke a window. Have we spoken about this before? I feel like you're often you sort of veer into therapy, and I feel like you've delved into this territory before. I don't know.
Probably the shoe beating. It sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar, so let's not retread that. It's obviously something that preoccupies me. So
Is your father Irish too?
he's from an Irish family. His dad was born in Dublin, so there is an Irish connection there. He himself is English, but also Catholic. But are we recording, by the way? Have we started?
Well, I don't know. You're so interesting that I just want to keep everything.
Flattery will get you absolutely everywhere, by the way.
Yeah, little crumbs of Andrew Doyle.
Yeah. What did you want to talk about today?
Well, we're talking. There's a lot of things to do. The woke, the end of woke, whatever's happening now, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Apparently, you immigrated. Hope
Well,
you
I
did
mean,
so legally because you'll be hunted.
I'm in the
I
process.
got ice on speed dial. Just
I'm in the process of doing it. What I'm hoping is that I will be able to reside here in the US on a semi-permanent basis,
Okay.
and then work on a semi-permanent basis. But it will all depend on whether my visa application is successful. I'm hoping they see me as an asset rather than one of these filthy immigrants coming in to steal the jobs. And so we shall see. That is
What
still
job would you be stealing? Sitting in the studio apartment?
a writer of anti-woke books, and
Okay.
there's a lot of people over here who are, there's a big industry here. So I don't want to be some wetback, occupying that corner of the industry. But we shall see. So all of that is very much up for. I mean, at the moment, I've done some work this year because I came over in January to teach a course on wokeness at the New College of Florida, which I did just a few weeks in January. Which was great fun, but it was weird because it caused a bit of a storm, and I didn't quite realize the extent of it. I know there was a hit piece in The Guardian which was very much focused on me and contained a surprising number of factual inaccuracies, not least that it was so funny. I mean, they call me, what was it, right-wing provocateur or something like this, and then it said, the course has been reinstated after a backlash, and that wasn't true. It was never uninstated. It was always very much stated. And then they talked about, so this was the funniest bit. So the guy who wrote this Guardian article, because the course was about the woke movement, he said, well, the Guardian has looked into this. We've submitted freedom of information requests to the government to find out which organizations call themselves woke or part of a woke movement. And in other words, this person genuinely thought that the only way you could subscribe to an ideology was to apply for tax exemptions and operate in that way. Like, he was that literal minded.
Well, I mean, with everything that came out about USAID, not exactly inaccurate to think that.
Fair enough. Yeah, there is that. But I'm sure that's not what he had in mind. But it was funny because when I got to the college, the guy who runs it said to me that it had caused much more of a storm than I realized. I thought it was just one or two articles, but no, he was invited on TV to defend me, to teach this course, and it was all very weird because the reading list which was out there, it was in the public domain, included Ibram X. Kendi, included Robin DiAngelo, included Richard Delgado. It had it also had Christopher Rufo. It also had, my own books. It also had the anti-woke side, but it had both. So, I mean, I wasn't doing what everyone else does, which is to attempt to indoctrinate people in wokeness and say, this is incontestable fact. Critical race theory is incontestable fact. Gender identity is incontestable fact. I was doing the opposite. I was saying, so some people believe this is the case. Let's analyze that and talk about that. And also I was continually wanting to hear the pro-woke side, because I always am, and I always want to have that discussion. But there was this incredible assumption by The Guardian, not just The Guardian, but all these other people, that this was some kind of, bigoted, reactionary crusade that the New College of Florida were therefore just trying to indoctrinate
Do you think
students.
that they really think that, or that's just the way that they are paid to formulate events?
I always assume that people mean what they say, so I think they
Really?
do.
Even the woke?
I think it's
Even
safe.
journalists?
Look, I know what you're saying. A lot of them are duplicitous. A lot of them are most definitely misrepresenting the truth. I've caught many journalists out in outright lies. This is true. On the other hand, I always think that when it comes to if someone says they believe something, I'm not sure what the function of saying I don't think you do, what that function is. I think all it does is it kind of disobliges you from engaging with the argument. I think you're sort of saying, well, these opinions are not sincerely held, and therefore I don't have to bother talking to you. But actually, an argument kind of stands or falls on the basis of how strong the argument is, not the extent to which it is sincerely held. So I just assuming good faith is, I think, the way forward, even if the other person is being mendacious. because you can always have that conversation. You can always expose the contradictions and the follies of a particular point of view, even if they don't genuinely believe it. I think I've always thought that's the way. Although, you know, obviously, if there is absolutely clear evidence that someone has lied, then that is absolutely worth pointing out. But I think this guy who wrote for The Guardian genuinely believed that I was this kind of reactionary, that you know, that people sort of make this idea up in their heads, or they go off the basis of reputation. As you know, that's how most of online discourse works, on the basis of straw men, on the basis of folk devils. I just wrote a piece for my Substack actually about Elon Musk being the new folk devil, and it's really been interesting, because whenever you've seen all these viral videos of the protest, the anti-Musk protests, and people going up to them and saying, so what is it about? You've got a sign there that says Musk is a fascist, Musk is a criminal, should be arrested. What is your evidence for his fascism? And all they've got is that they misinterpreted a hand gesture that they thought looked a bit like a Sieg Heil, right? That's all they've got. So these aren't, you know, and I think they all genuinely believe it, but what they've done is they've created this folk devil, they've decided he is the epitome of evil. Just as they did with J.K. Rowling, just as they did with Jordan Peterson. And it's always the case when you actually meet these people. Well, you know this, you know, you've been told for years that someone's a demon in human form, that, you know, they've got hooves concealed in their brogues. And when you actually meet them, you discover them to be very, very friendly, very nice. This happened to me when all this cultural nonsense began, and as you know, all of my friends were left wing. I was on the comedy circuit, all my friends were on the left, and there was one particular guy, I won't name his name because he's very well known, who everyone told me he's absolutely evil. He's horrible. He just wants to demonize minorities, all the rest of it. I've actually since become good friends with him, and he's one of the most generous, charitable, lovely human beings I know. And isn't that interesting that I'd fallen for it? I thought he was Beelzebub. I was convinced of it because everyone said that he was. And now I just don't trust reputation. Now well, how do you feel about that, Benjamin? When you must have experienced something comparable.
Wait, so you didn't just get familiar and comfortable with demonizing minorities? It turns out he doesn't actually do that.
Doesn't do it at all. Yeah, he just doesn't do it. But and in the way that Elon Musk does not support the tenets of National Socialism. And if you're going to make that claim, you better have some pretty solid evidence of that, rather than, I thought he was doing a Sieg Heil, when of course he was. I mean, that is the most preposterous. That's one of those things where you know that most people don't believe that, right? But again, we go back to this point. You have to assume that they actually are that soft-witted. You have to assume that. You have to assume that I mean, look, if you freeze frame it, absolutely it looks like that. But you notice that the clip that was disseminated online cut out, doctored away that sentence where he said, "My heart goes out to you." Why? Because that explains the whole damn thing. And you know, so that seems duplicitous. But by the same token, maybe people do believe it. A few people. I don't think many do. I like to think most people are intelligent people.
I think so many people are, and it's hard for me to get into the frame of mind. So many people are embedded in a media ecosystem that reaffirms a certain interpretation over and over and over and over and over again. And then the contrary, if you just go and watch TV, people still watch TV, which is just weird to me. Because I just see clips on Twitter. So I'm kind of like in its other media ecosystem, and I have to, be very cognizant of the slop specifically that I'm being fed, and avoid that, because it does affirm and excite bias in interpretation and in just.
I mean, absolutely. I agree. I mean, if you stop to think about it for 1 second, if you stop to think about, hold a minute. So, if your contention is that Musk is a clandestine Nazi who is, manipulating the government and pulling the strings, and he wants to advance his power base, but what he does is on the Trump's inaugural celebration, at that point when there are millions of people watching on TV, that's the point where he lets the mask slip and does a Nazi salute, and his entire evil scheme is revealed. If you thought about it for just 1 second, you would understand how preposterous and how foolish that is. But nonetheless, they do stick to the idea. They cling to it. I mean, who was the guy on CNN the other day? The Democrat representative, is it Jamal Bowman? A guy called Bowman? I'm not all that familiar. I don't know who he is. I just saw him the other day. It's just saying on CNN he's a Nazi. He actually says he's a Nazi. Now, why that is astonishing, not just because it's an elected political representative who is obviously an intelligent man. He must be to have reached that position. But the fact that he is so caught up in that echo chamber, that bubble, that pseudo reality, that he's forgotten about libel, that he's forgotten about defamation, and the fact that the person he's defaming is the richest man in the world. He's so caught up in this fantasy world that he just says it naturally and doesn't think, oh, that might be ill-advised. And of course, Musk is now saying he's going to sue him, as he should. But, you know, and all these people keying Teslas and attacking attacking, they've forgotten about the rule of law. They've forgotten about the fact that every Tesla has a 360-degree camera. You're going to be on film. You're going to go to prison. But because they're just being reaffirmed by their friends online saying, yeah, this is the resistance.
Not just their friends online, the Tonight Show, just the whole media system is doing it.
Like, that's not the real world. We live in a world with laws and and the possibility of going to prison for damaging someone else's property. Yet they're damaging people's property you want. That's not Musk anyway. I know they've created this folk devil and they want to get back at Musk. This is someone else's car that was bought from a company owned by the guy that you happen to disagree with politically, and you've turned into this folk devil. This is infantilism writ large. This is tantrumizing. I know that's not a word, but I like it. I'm going to keep it.
I like it too. Yeah.
Well,
it goes back to what you're talking about reputation. People believe in reputation. Reputation does have social currency and valence.
It does. It does. A fellow called it the immortal part of myself. I think there is a, towards the end of the Crucible, when John Proctor, he says he will hang because all he has is his name. He says, I only have one name in my life. Reputation is so important, and it's so protean. And, you know, it really matters to people what other people think of them. It sort of cuts to the heart of who we are. This is why we all feel a bit nagging, or this horrible gnawing sensation when we know that someone is believing something about us that isn't true. That injustice, which goes back to childhood. The worst thing in childhood, isn't it? When you know you haven't done something wrong, but you're getting in trouble for it. It's something about us. We can't bear it, and it is powerful. You know, if you want to destroy people, destroy the reputation. That's absolutely the way you do it. So I suppose.
Well, then how do you become immune to that? Because, like you just said about the woke course that you did, your reputation was slandered. Right?
Yeah.
So, but at some point, you figured out that it doesn't really matter.
Because I'm being slandered by the Guardian. I mean, that's actually, if anything, that's a bonus.
Right.
That's a bonus.
Reputation.
Oh my
Speaking
God.
of reputations.
The Guardian has its own reputation, but one that is deserved for prioritizing their ideology over facts, because they've been caught out in factual inaccuracies over and over and over again. And, you know, so I don't mind if they smear me. It helps. I think it's quite funny. I retweeted the article. I was like, come on. You know, if someone like that has misapprehended you, then that's, you know, it's like when The Guardian came along to see, I did a live stage version of Titania McGrath, where an actor played Titania. Yeah. And The Guardian review.
Like a trans person or an actress?
It was an actress. Called Alice Marshall, and she was brilliant. And we did we got to do it in the West End, even in London, a one-off West End show. And this gives you an idea of just the extent to which her detractors and fans were on political lines. The Daily Mail, which is the right-leaning paper in the UK, gave the show 5 stars and said this was brilliant. The Guardian gave it 1 star and said it was awful. And that just, to me, encapsulates that, you know, people tend to like it or hate it on the basis of how much they agree with the idea of satirizing this movement. But it was interesting because The Guardian actually used the phrase in their review, what are we laughing at? And of course, that went on the poster straight away. You know, that it's like a gift. It really is. We're laughing at you, Guardian. That's why you don't get it, because you're not the target audience. You're the target. Mm-hmm. So you don't see it. And so it was absolutely perfect. You know, if The Guardian were a bit smarter, they would give things like that middling reviews, say, oh, it's okay, but just a bit boring. You know what I mean? They wouldn't go full on and say 1 star, terrible, we hate it, because that is just helpful. I've noticed that recently when books come out, like for instance, I think Douglas Murray's last book, The Guardian just didn't review it, or, you know, whereas they used to slate everything he said because they despise everything he says. But all that does is draw attention to it, make people want to read it more. Yeah. And I think they're waking up to this now. I think they realize just ignore, the Streisand effect. I think they're saying that, well, let's just ignore the stuff we don't like. And that is the best from their point of view strategically. That is the absolute best way to go, isn't it? I crave nothing more than a bad Guardian review. It is so it's erotic to me.
Well, I can't wait till they review our conversation here. How do you think that the Guardian's behavior, is that similar or identical to some aspect of what it is to be woke? If we're talking about wokeness as a academic subject and the Guardian as the standard bearer of woke journalism, what is it about the Guardian's behavior that tells us something about woke?
I think principally it's this, the fact that they are divorced from the notion of truth, or that truth is never a priority, which for news reporting is a real problem. I mean, we know that one of the key features of the woke is revisionism. Historical revisionism is the idea that there are multiple ways of knowing. You know this, that everyone has their own truth, and therefore there is no objective truth. And therefore, if they say something is the case, then it becomes the case. If they say that.
Well, that depends. We can't completely dismiss that notion. I mean, you as somebody who's a storyteller understand that there's different ways to tell a story, even the same facts. History is written, right?
No. History is absolutely interpreted. I'm not talking about the revisionism insofar as reinterpreting in a plausible way things that may or may not have happened. Absolutely. No, I'm talking about verifiable facts being denied, which is not quite the same thing. That's not quite the same thing. So, for instance, for the Guardian, let's give an example. The We Spa event. Now, do you know about this Korean spa in Los Angeles where there was a viral video of an Instagram woman, a woman who's popular on Instagram. I think she was called Cubana Angel. And the video is her. It's a black woman. She's just been in the changing room with her daughter, young girl. And there's a man there in the changing room, naked, semi-erect. And she's shouting at the person on the front desk, saying there's a naked man my little girl's there, what the hell's going on? And of course the staff have to say, but that person identifies as a woman, therefore and then it kicked off, and then there were feminist protesters outside. It turns out, by the way, that man had a previous criminal record for indecent exposure.
And he's on estrogen, so the semi-erect penis was probably a fully erect penis. Just want to clarify that.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you're here for those kind of phallic details. That is your area of speciality. So then we have that protest, and then you have opportunists from the far right turning up, because of course they also object to gender identity ideology, but their position is that it is degenerate. So they turn up, and then you have this. And then what you have, of course, is people conflating the far right with the female protest, not realizing that there's two completely different protests. And of course, people on the far right aren't known for being pro women's rights. It's like when the Let Women Speak event took place in Melbourne, Australia, and there were neo-Nazis opportunistically turning up. And of course, that meant that everyone then said, oh, they're the same as the feminists. And of course, they're completely diametrically opposed.
Well, I mean, that's not organic, but come on.
What do you mean?
We don't know. See, this is the thing. Everything's a side, like this Patriot Front, or all of a sudden Nazis show up. It's like, come on, that's the government.
You think that's the government? Really? Well, look, hey, I don't know, but all I know is that there are.
I mean, it's my government, not Australia's, but it's still the government.
But we're talking about people who turned up self-identifying as Nazis. Let's put it that way, okay? And you also
in masks.
Yeah, and you also had then a group called the Socialist Alliance, who are an anti-fascist group.
Also the government.
But they didn't attack. You're so conspiratorial today. But they didn't. They didn't go after the Nazis. They went after the feminists. My point was this: that when the Guardian reported on what happened outside the We Spa, they said that there was no distinguishing, that the feminists were a far right group. They lied about them. They conflated the two. They also lied. They said it was a hoax. They said that the idea that there had been someone with intact male genitalia in the women's changing area was a hoax, was not true. They said that twice. They said it even after it became absolutely clear. They said it even after it was revealed that the guy had a record for indecent exposure. So that's the problem, so that's an example of where a demonstrable falsehood is reported as truth. Now that's something that the woke do. Now,
well, that's a means, but to what end?
Right. Well, if you can change the narrative, you can enforce your ideology. Every tyrannical, despotic regime in history has known this. I mean, it's the crux of 1984. by the end of the novel, Winston Smith is saying, intoning, 2 + 2 = 5, because that is the narrative that the party, INGSOC, has said that he must follow. You know that this is the case. So control it now. And this is why I know you're going to take me to task. I know you're not happy about the whole woke right thing, and I know I wrote about that, and it's something that bothers.
Oh no, you had a run-in with bigots.
Yeah, but my point was that both sides share this detachment from reality. So I saw just 2 days ago, I saw a viral video. I don't know how viral it was, but it showed up on my feed, and I'd never heard of the guy, so I assume it was being shared. And it was a video of a guy, a right-wing conservative guy, showing images from the Pathé newsreels in the Open Platz in Berlin, where Goebbels and the students were tossing books onto the fire. And he was saying, yes, you see this and you think this is bad, but what you don't know is that all of these books came from Magnus Hirschfeld's Clinic of Sexology, and these were degenerate books, etc. And therefore, maybe we have to burn these kind of books. In other words, this was an endorsement of Nazism through the misreading of history, or actually the misrepresentation of history. He will know, if he's done any reading whatsoever, that yes, there were books from the Magnus Hirschfeld's clinic in that pyre, but they were not the majority of the books in that pyre. There were books by Victor Hugo, there were books by James Joyce, there were books by Oscar Wilde. This was about destroying anything that was considered un-German or degenerate or politically dissident. All right. So, and he must know that, because that is verifiable historical fact. That's not a matter of interpretation. But what he's doing there is misrepresenting the truth in order to promote fascism. So what I'm saying is anyone who is truly ideological, isn't thinking for themselves, is just following a script, will have that means to an end idea that it's okay to lie. In political Islam, you'd call it taqiyya. It's okay to lie about the truth if the ends justify it, if your message is spread, if it works for you. And that's common to all ideologies, I think. And that's why I don't trust ideological thinking. That's why I would never align myself with the tribe. Does that sort of make sense?
Adhere to the truth insofar as you can.
As much as I can, given on the understanding that I'm bound to be wrong about an awful lot of things at any given time. But at least, attempting to verify, not just outsourcing my reasoning to a preordained script that has been decided by someone else. I mean, I don't understand what the I see that as a kind of intellectual death. Why would you do that to yourself?
Well, it also creeps in that one attempts to be non-extremist and non-ideological, and then they just are unaware of their own ideology, right? They're unaware of their own processes. That's what I enjoy about the so-called woke right versus classical liberal discourse, is that the classical liberals are living in an age that has kind of passed them by. The 90s are no longer over. The marketplace of ideas is kind of suspect. The pursuit of truth is always going to be corrupted by power, because you have to organize politically. You have to defend your homeland, and truth is secondary to.
My understanding of what you're saying there, and what I've garnered from what the dissident writer is saying, is that someone's got to be in power at any given time, and it may as well be. I mean, that seems to be what you.
Well, it's going to be somebody.
Yeah, but
I think everybody, including the liberals, yourself among them, would prefer power to operate according to your principles rather than.
But I don't trust anyone who's in power. I mean, I think that was the whole reason that the Constitution was formulated in the way that it was. I think that the founding fathers, the genius of the founding fathers, was that they were fully aware of the corruptibility of humankind. If you read your Shakespeare, you know that this is something that is unavoidable. So I don't trust anyone who's in power from any political ideology, and I think they should always be held to account, and there should always be checks and balances. And the idea that we should just say because one side is worse than the other, then we shouldn't hold the other side to account is, I think, is anathema to me.
Yeah. It's the material reality that even though the Constitution is a very highly idealistic pursuit, it's never actually been tried. It never actually has been implemented. It's always been.
That's liberalism. Liberalism in a nutshell. Liberalism actually hasn't been properly implemented, because it can't be. It can't be, because it recognizes the imperfectibility of humankind. It recognizes the flaws. It says things are always going to be corrupt. Things are always going to go wrong. It's a process of continually standing up to illiberalism whenever it occurs, authoritarianism when it occurs, trying to course correct continually. You get this from both sides. You get this from the right sort of saying liberalism clearly hasn't worked because look at what a mess we're in, or you get it from the woke left. You say, there's still racism. Look, there's still so liberalism clearly doesn't work. It's like liberalism doesn't suggest that there is a utopian endpoint that we reach that proves that liberalism was a success. It acknowledges that we are post-lapsarian beings, that we are fallen, that we will never. They wouldn't use it in religious terminology, but you know what I mean. That that we're continually having to challenge stuff. We're continually having to, we're chasing an ever receding horizon because we're dealing ultimately with flawed human beings. We are not infallible.
Yeah, but you want to live in a particular society with a particular culture.
Yeah. I want to live in not necessarily, but I want to live in a society where everyone is free to do whatever they want, say whatever they want, act in whatever the way they want, right up until the point that they're encroaching on the rights of others. And it is as simple as that.
Yeah, but does that actually work? I mean,
never been tried.
It's never been tried. Yeah, but because human beings can't just do something in their room and have it not affect everybody else in one way or another.
I'm sure you've done stuff in your room that doesn't affect me.
It affects me. It affects my character, and then it affects my values. I mean, there's tack-on effects. There's trickle effects.
Yeah, sure, but okay. Well, let's explore that a little more. So, the argument, I suppose, and you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong. I mean, the argument that you're making is that, we don't live in a bubble. The things that we do have societal impact, and therefore we have a kind of responsibility, a kind of collective responsibility. But I would count. Am I right? That's sort of what you're saying.
Well, let's explore that. Yeah.
So I think it depends on how you perceive liberalism. I understand.
We can bring up surrogacy.
Okay. Well, let's just. Let me try and break it down in the way that I'm thinking so that you understand where I'm coming from.
Okay.
I think a lot of critics of liberalism misunderstand what liberalism is. I think they are mistaking liberty for license. And I think that's an ancient Christian distinction, which is one that if people want to understand it more, they should read John Milton on this. He wrote about this very, very explicitly. In fact, he wrote a sonnet. One of his sonnets talks about how, they criticize me. He's talking about his critics. He wrote a tract about how in support of divorce. He had his own personal reasons for that because he didn't get on with his wife. But nevertheless, he wrote this tract in support of divorce. And a lot of the critics was basically saying...
Such cases.
Yeah, there are. A lot of critics of Milton said he was effectively trying to get a free-for-all, get an anarchy, the idea that people should be able to do whatever they want. And he says they're talking about license and I'm talking about liberty. They're misunderstanding the two things. Now, I think... my conceptualization of liberalism involves this idea of cultivating a society within which certain behaviors are encouraged. In other words, what we would call socialization, strong education, the rule of law. It's not that these parameters don't exist. It's just that within a liberal system, we collectively cultivate this sense of social responsibility, the way that we ought to behave through education, through the rule of law, through interaction, through our everyday society.
Through the process, yeah.
But what we say as liberals is, but if you want to violate that social contract that is thereby cultivated, that's on you. But at least you're violating it with an understanding of the consequences insofar as, you make yourself a pariah. Look, I can scream obscenities on the corner of the street. That's my right. That's my freedom of speech. But I will no longer have friends. People will walk away from me. I'm not going to get a job, right? So in other words, I think it is a major misunderstanding to confuse liberty and license, to say that liberals are saying you should be able to do whatever the hell you want. They're not saying that. They're saying that we need to have those parameters in society that are collectively agreed. We do have law. Yeah. And remember that breaking the law also involves encroaching on the rights of others. So that, of course, violates the liberal principle. And I think we need to get back to this notion of... I read that book by Patrick Deneen, I think, Why Liberalism Failed. And, his argument is very compelling. He's a brilliant writer. And what he's talking about is not the liberalism I'm talking about. So, I think I would say that book's title could be more accurately rendered Why a Perverted Form of Liberalism Failed. He very much sees liberalism as an anarchic free-for-all. And I don't.
Inevitably.
Yeah, and I don't.
Because the liberals, you evoked these, somehow we have these parameters that come from somewhere, but they don't come from liberalism. So
Right.
liberalism can't reinstate these parameters. The parameters have to come from authority, and the authority has to be derived from custom, which inevitably is encoded in a religion. So this liberal process, this liberal ability to judge people or to foster in people the ability to be free within certain parameters can't in and of itself erect or maintain those parameters. So liberalism cannot exist without parameters. It has, and it came from Christianity, so one would suppose that it's probably attuned to Christian presuppositions.
But that's a bigger question, isn't it? Whether there are moral absolutes that transcend the Christian framework, and I think that there are. I think that I think you can apply a kind of Kantian notion of a universal truth, the categorical imperative, the idea that murder, for instance, is, I think, it is a universal sin, irrespective of whether you believe in God or not. I think those are the bigger questions, of course. If you're going to say that we need to have socialization and education in order to give adults freedom and autonomy, because they're making an informed choice, because they're making a choice on the basis of a framework that exists. Of course, that framework isn't provided by liberalism, and it has to be provided by something. And it has to come from somewhere. Those are bigger philosophical questions that I'm not equipped to answer.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I would say is that those universal truths, those universal laws, can kind of be encapsulated in the idea that I mentioned, that's spoken about so eloquently in On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, of this notion of freedom up until the point of encroaching on the rights of others. That in of itself is a benchmark by which everyone could live, surely. Because that encapsulates all those universal truths that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but that really, really depends on what you mean by encroaching on the rights of others.
For instance, what are the essential human rights that we have? Freedom of speech, freedom to live, freedom not to be harmed, right? These are the kind of rights that I'm talking about. As soon as you violate those, commit murder, commit violence, commit rape, then of course that violates those rules.
Okay, well, yeah, that's bodily, but there's psychic tack-on effects. There was this really interesting article that was memory holed by Rolling Stone about the two producers, writers, and directors of The Matrix, and how after The Matrix they received a big payday and then ended up going to BDSM dungeons and got, well, the colloquial term is trooned out, but that might be derogatory. I'm not quite sure. But they went into this whole path of, behavior that is ignoble, inhumane, but under the liberal framework, you do you. But then they come back after going through that process and they start producing media again, and then they blast this ideology through their art, and they use the liberal framework of you do you, whatever doesn't do bodily harm to others is okay, even if they're literally partaking in bodily harm on a variety of different vectors, and then using their freedom of speech. Is that not encroaching on like a communal standard?
Not if you've cultivated a truly liberal society, because it doesn't threaten me when someone behaves in a way that I do not approve of. It doesn't threaten me if someone tries to propagate an ideology that I don't agree with.
It doesn't threaten you, but doesn't it degrade society? And doesn't that also go back to the fact that we are fallen beings, and that the more society is corrupted, the more it will corrupt?
It doesn't degrade society. It doesn't degrade society to the extent that authoritarian solutions to the problem you describe would degrade the society.
Well,
what is worse? A couple of people in a sex dungeon doing no harm to anyone, behaving consensually, and then going out and saying everyone should behave like this. What is worse, that or a state that's going to prevent them from behaving as they want, throw them in prison for what they say? What is more degrading to society? I mean, I think it's quite clearly the latter.
Well, it seems like the standards of liberalism, or the authoritarianism that's hidden in liberalism, is hidden through persuasion rather than coercion. Like we'll socialize and we'll teach. So basically, we'll manipulate people to think these things rather than enforce people.
Persuasion is not authoritarian. It's the precise opposite. It's where you've said, I'm going to engage with you verbally precisely because I don't want to engage with you physically. I don't want to violate you through violence. Persuasion, language, discussion, these can never be authoritarian because they represent a negation of authoritarianism.
Persuasion at scale is called propaganda. And
does propaganda work? I mean, most of the studies suggest that propaganda is largely ineffective.
Well, we have to go back to the number of people that believe that Elon Musk is a Nazi because they've been convinced through propaganda means that he is.
No, I don't think that's because of propaganda. I think that's because of a failure of critical thinking, which comes about precisely because of this failure of socialization that I've been alluding to. I mean, the problem is, like, all of the studies into, for example, the propaganda during Nazi Germany have been quite clear about this, that even though that, obviously you have a society that was hateful towards Jews, or hate-filled, and you think you can put that down to Der Stürmer and the various imagery that was going out by the government. But the studies clearly show that in areas where anti-Semitic tendencies were very low, the propaganda had the opposite effect. In areas where there was a
excited sympathy.
Yeah. In areas where there was a pre-existing antipathy towards Jewish people, the propaganda had an effect. In other words, propaganda works when people are already predisposed to the message that is being pumped out.
So you use propaganda to predispose people to propaganda.
No, you don't predispose. No, you play on people's predispositions. So that's why with Musk, of course, when you put out stuff that he's a Nazi, that's going to land because people have already decided that he's a Nazi. They've already got that idea before the propaganda begins. It's not.
Where did the idea come from, if not from propaganda? I
mean, the cultivation of a discourse over many, many years. It's not. You can't just say that.
Yeah.
Musk, because you saw I'm sure you saw the stats on the popularity of Musk. He was hugely popular amongst Democrats up until a certain point, and now he's gone down to something like minus 91% in the opinion polls, like a huge, incredible drop. And that didn't just happen because someone put out an anti-Musk propaganda advert and suddenly everyone is brainwashed into thinking the reverse. This is completely incorrect. What has happened is there's a long period of discourse, discussion.
Propaganda.
No, collective fantasies that have been generated through human interaction. Unless you can point to me a set of propaganda campaigns that directly led to a complete transformation.
We're discussing an incredibly complex system. You bring up human interaction and discourse, but the amount of propaganda, intentional smearing of Donald Trump by the people who control most of the U.S. government preceded, and once you link anybody to Trump, then the propaganda just jumps over to Elon Musk. I'm sure it was already built up with Trump, and then the propaganda machines have read it, which doesn't necessarily have to be entirely intentional. You get enough things going at enough time, you can do stochastic propaganda, right? You can just have propaganda emerge.
Sure, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, isn't it? You seem to take the view that propaganda was engineered and disseminated, and therefore people's minds started to change about Trump and Musk. I don't think so. I think it was the other way around. I think what happened was through discourse, collective perception, animosity that was amplified, all sorts of a massively complex scenario that we couldn't possibly begin to quantify here. Reputations started to develop, and then they were reinforced by propaganda. Those predisposed to despise Trump they'll seize on everything. Oh, he tells people to drink bleach, even though he didn't tell people to drink bleach. But it fits with my preconceived notion, so I'm going to amplify that more. Yeah. So it is that very much a chicken and egg thing. I think trying to put this down to one single causality of propaganda is to get it entirely backwards. I think propaganda thrives because the conditions have been cultivated within which it can thrive.
Yeah, via propaganda. I'm just saying propaganda.
That's the chicken and egg thing, isn't
it? It's basically in the absence of coercive power, you have persuasive power. And if you look at the history of the United States and your great country of Britain, who developed propaganda at the Tavistock Clinic of all places, they have very intentionally studied psychology, human psychology and sociology, and they've deployed those means in order to affect power, because power is no longer
remember,
overt.
Key failing you're making here is that you are conflating persuasive power and coercive power. They're actually diametrically opposite, right? You can't persuade someone. If you're coercing someone and you're persuading them, it's the exact opposite. People aren't saying this stuff about Trump because they've been persuaded or because they've been coerced, or it's because of persuasion. It's because of persuasion is you respecting someone enough to say, I'm going to talk to you about this. We're going to reach a conclusion. We're going to tease it out. That's not the same as coercion. You see persuasion as coercion. And I think that
with enough with enough advanced persuasion techniques, you can just manipulate people to think the way that you want them to think. You can predispose people to be predisposed towards your propaganda.
You can do that with some people, certainly. There are some people who are clearly immune to that. We're dealing with humanity. Yeah. It's a complex.
Well, being inoculated to that and immune to that is the cause, or the principal value of a true education.
And that's the inoculation. That's what I was saying earlier. That's precisely it. If you are effectively educated, if you know how to think critically, if you have all those skills, you will absolutely not be susceptible to coercion to the same degree that you're describing. So
if you look at like who's most,
all of this comes back. But I know what you're going to say. But those academics are, of course, not thinking critically. That's the whole problem. They have been failed by education. They might have the degree certificates that they can wave around, but they haven't been well educated. Like absolutely the opposite. Anyway, you mentioned the Tavistock. Did you want to get onto that? Because obviously, as you know, I've got a lot of you
got buddies in there.
I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Okay, well, yeah, let's get there. I just wanted to make one point. Coercive power is never going to not be there.
Sure.
The monopoly on violence, and so and then persuasive power is, especially in an era of communication, mass communication, is always going to be ever present. So the two tools that one has to guard oneself from coercive and persuasive power is critical thinking and a handgun. So I'm just going to make that statement. And you're British, so I think we just have to modify that too. You guys are allowed to have spoons, not knives anymore, but spoons are still
spoons. We can hit people with spoons, and I would suggest to you that of those two options,
ladles.
The education is the ladles. I would say I think you have both. Education is the preferable solution. I am not denying that people cannot be coerced. I'm not denying that people are suggestible or open to persuasion or anything of that kind. What I'm saying is the inoculation is the very thing that we're lacking. That kind of education, which I didn't get, which most of us didn't get, that is the liberal solution.
Really? You didn't get it?
Of course I didn't. I was taught by nuns.
Oh, shoe. Critical shoe theory.
Quite. I mean, isn't the shoe just the handgun in another form?
Oh yes, okay, that makes sense. No, the handgun. The handgun would that both people have shoes, and that there's a viable threat that the nun's going to get beat back by the 4-year-old, which isn't there. So,
well, if I was armed, that could have ended very differently, I suppose.
Yeah.
Except
with some stigmatas. Oh.
Except I was well socialized in the 10 Commandments, so I know that thou shalt not kill, and especially thou shalt not kill a nun. I think that would have been straight to hell. That would have been the lowest circle of Dante. That would have been the central, the bit in the middle of hell in the Inferno where Lucifer is trapped in the lake, and he's beating his big leathery bat-like wings, and that's why the center of hell is actually freezing cold, because he's constantly trying to escape from the frozen lake, and in doing so, continually freezes the lake. So the more that Satan tries to escape, the more he's Wow. That's where I'd be if I killed a nun, in one of his mouths. He's got 3 mouths and he's chewing. Who is he chewing? He's chewing Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius.
And Andrew Doyle, yeah.
And the 4th mouth for me, because I took a handgun to a nun. I think that would be a legitimate form of punishment. I think it would be condign, if I'm honest.
Well, I mean, if you look at, back to the Tavistock, and I want to hear you go off on it. And I like your little pill box there. That's interesting.
This is actually for ear plugs.
Cool.
I just have it with me for some reason, and I'm just fiddling with it.
Yeah,
maybe I should be a bit more disciplined. If there was a nun here, she'd wrap my knuckles with a...
Stem out, Andrew Doyle. Stem out.
What does stem out mean?
It's the thing that the kids do because they think that they're ADHD or autistic, so they just fiddle. It's just like uninhibited fiddling.
Is?
Yeah.
I saw people doing that. I do fiddle a lot. I'm constantly sort of fidgeting.
Yeah. Do you do the... We've never met in person. I'm sad that you moved out of London. I wasn't able to meet you, even though I know you don't live in London. But do you tap your foot?
Yes, always.
You're one of those? Okay. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I like to think I'm just naturally rhythmic. And, in the back of my head, I've just got a Cole Porter tune murmuring along. I don't know what it is. But yeah, you're right. Very shrewd, aren't you, Benjamin?
Shrewd?
Shrewd.
Is that like the feminine form of a strudel?
Strudel is a kind of apple dessert. I was talking about shrewd. Imagine a shrew, the rodent, but with a D on it. That's you. And you're kind of like what's his name? Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Looking for
absolutely.
little ticks.
But
But a combination of Sherlock Holmes and Hannibal Lecter. You know, if you could smell me, you'd probably tell me what scent I was wearing yesterday. Don't you think?
So I do it all through Zoom though, so it's just micro.
What do you think I'm wearing? If you want to know, I'm wearing a scent called Amare, which I bought on the island of Capri, and I'd recommend it. I smell divine right now, and it's just sad to me that you're missing out because of the nature of digital conversation. You can't.
No, that's fine. That's fine. The conversation just got very, very gay, and I'm fine with it because I'm a true liberal like you.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily gay. I think people can bond over scents. I think male bonding can be associated with perfume. I think what I might do is rub a lock of my hair in the scent and send it to
locks.
Locks of hair.
Yeah, like a little rat tail behind you or something.
Well, I will grow a lock of hair so that I can send it to you.
I'll frame it.
I will douse it in the perfume.
In my reliquary.
Among your reliquary there. Exactly. Yeah. Next to John
Tavistock, though. Gender ideology. Pure propaganda.
Yeah.
And it leads to coercion.
Slightly different, though, isn't it? Because propaganda implies malevolence, implies Machiavellianism, implies sinister intent. And that wasn't going on at the Tavistock. Now, I think I don't think it was. You know, I've spoken to people who have just genuinely 100% bought into the notion of gender identity ideology, just completely. And that includes an awful lot of medical practitioners. We had in the House of Lords recently, Jackie Smith, Baroness Jackie Smith, who is the spokesperson for women and equalities in the House of Lords, I believe, for the Labour Party. And of course, the Labour government has been pushing through all sorts of legislation on the basis of the existence of such a thing as gender identity. And therefore, in the House of Lords debate, someone on the opposing bench said, what is the government's working definition of gender identity? And she couldn't do it. And not only could she not define it, she actually said, I think you should take this more seriously. You know, in this incredible deflection, because she was stumped. Because, but I think it's an uninterrogated belief. I think that's what's happening. You know, if we were able to talk to, you know, there's a reason why Keir Starmer refuses to meet with LGBT Alliance or Sex Matters or all the other groups. There's a reason why this has been allowed to persist. If you could sit down with all of these people and say, look, let's have an open conversation. What do you mean by gender identity? What evidence do you have for the existence of a sexed soul within the body? And what justification do you have, if you cannot provide evidence for that? What possible justification could you have for implementing public health policy on the basis of a supernatural belief? And you know, when you get down to it, it would collapse pretty soon. The reason why it's gone on so long is because of the no debate mantra that Stonewall was so insistent.
Stonewalled.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. You know, there's that nominative determinism going on. Why didn't we have those conversations? And we're getting there now, thanks to the Cass review, because they chose somebody who had no skin in the game, one of the leading paediatricians in the country. You know, this isn't someone who was knee deep in the bloody waters of this debate. But she was able to rigorously examine the evidence, reject all the evidence that wasn't sufficiently, robust, and provide a 400-page document that I actually read from cover to cover because so few people did. And she was able to say, look, there are all sorts of problems with prescribing, for medicalizing children on the basis of a supernatural belief. She didn't put it in those terms, of course, but that is absolutely, in fact, you know, the language that she uses in the Cass review often slips into those sort of quasi-religious terms such as cisgender or trans child. These things are not real, but in a way that's political expediency, because you can't have this conversation unless you, to a degree, kind of bring those people along with you. It's a kind of a golden bridge, isn't it? And I think with the Tavistock, I think a lot of these people, I mean, I saw that Helen Weberly on LBC just talking about this, and she really does believe that there are people who are born in the wrong body. And she really does believe that the best thing you can do to kids is to medicalize them, to, you know, particularly even with the knowledge that we now have that the vast majority of these adolescents at the Tavistock, I think it was between 80 and 90% of the adolescents were same-sex attracted. This is largely kids who are going to grow up to be gay. Huge over representation of autism on their huge comorbidities, evidence of abuse, other things going on in their lives. She knows this, and she also must know that in the vast majority of cases, feelings of gender discomfort are resolved through puberty. So we were blocking the cure, and she was saying that we should block the cure because there is a minority of those people who are innately of the other sex because they have this soul that misaligns with their body. I don't think that is as, and I'm not sure you were implying this, but I don't think it is as Machiavellian. I don't think it is as calculated as you think. I think it is just more evidence of the human propensity, if not educated well, if not thinking critically, to slip into unevidenced belief systems. I think we as human beings have a propensity for magical thinking. I myself definitely do, and I think that is the new version of that. I also think that discomfort about homosexuality never goes away. I don't think it can, because I think your sexual orientation is something that is so visceral, so to do with the natural impulses, that of course any kind of sexual activity that is not to your taste elicits a kind of sense of disgust, in the way that a purely heterosexual man might find the prospect of fellatio on another man icky or disgusting, but similarly a gay man would find the equivalent with a woman disgusting. That's not evidence of misogyny. It's evidence of something that is so far away from your sexual taste that your instinct is that you find it rebarbative. So in that sense, I don't think when you have a minority sexual orientation, a sexual orientation that is by far not the norm, that is very much, it's only ever going to be a small number of people who fall that way, then of course there's going to be animosity, because disgust turns into animosity, and then that disgust is rationalized or irrationalized, if you like, into a way that, well, maybe we should try and eliminate that impulse, maybe we should eliminate that orientation, or maybe we should punish people who are different. I think that's why it happens, and I think what has happened with the transition, what has happened with the fixing of gay kids, effectively, which is exactly what they do in Iran. Of course, in Iran, if you are gay, the government will pay for you to have a sex change operation to fix you, to heterosexualize you. It isn't really different. It hasn't been thought through in that way, but I should imagine that there's a significant part of this. I mean, actually, a lot of the whistleblowers at the Tavistock spoke about how a lot of the parents expressed discomfort with the idea of having a gay son or daughter.
Yeah. Rather have a trans daughter than a gay son.
And although they might not say like that, the whistleblowers made clear that this was a major driving force, and not just amongst the parents, interestingly, but also amongst the staff. I mean, they had that joke amongst the staff of soon there won't be any gay people left, and they were making that joke, and they were joking, but
sounds kind of fascist.
Yeah, but I think they recognize. Okay, I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think they were recognizing the propensity among the intake, among the patients, to be same-sex attracted. They were recognizing that they were effectively kind of turning these people into pseudo-heterosexuals by changing the perception of their sex. And I think, therefore, they were using humor as a way to kind of, in fact, do the opposite, kind of perhaps deflate that kind of fascistic implication. By sort of saying, oh well, but many a true word, right? That is, you're absolutely right to say that there is a fascistic quality to that, but I don't believe that it was openly sought in the kind of targeted, deliberate way of the Nazis in the open plats, burning books they didn't like. I think it's or indeed medicalizing youth, or conducting experiments on the youth as they did. I think
but it ends up in the same place. You just went about getting there in a different way.
Right.
More persuasion rather than coercion.
That's what I'm That's what I'm talking about. And I'm not suggesting that people cannot engage in coercion, and particularly along this line. I mean, there was that article in Novara Media, which was talking about how if you want to get drugs from your doctor, just don't tell the whole truth. It put it in a really dodgy way. It said something like, don't lie, but just bend the truth a little. Just say what needs to be said to get the drugs that you need. Don't worry. It was really, I mean, that's someone telling you how to be coercive, and openly so. So, and that's why I want you to be clear. I'm not having a go at you for focusing on coercion as though I think it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that the persuasive approach is the opposite of that, and I'm uncomfortable with the idea of conflating the two, because I think what it involves is a view of a mistrust of humanity, effectively a kind of nihilistic idea that human beings are no more than drones, that we are just automata that act on cue on the basis of media messaging. And we know from all the evidence in the media effects theory that isn't the case. We know it's not the case. So much research into that. So if it's not the case, let's not assume that propaganda is this a tool that you think it is.
Well, you can't rationalize rationalize with an animal, right? So persuasive argumentation. Well,
we're not.
I don't know.
We're that weird. No, we're that weird hybrid between animal and God. Between we are a kind of spiritualized higher creature. We have a consciousness of our own mortality. We have empathy. We have these intense emotions. We are capable of love. We have something that is akin to the transcendental. That is not in the realm of the animal kingdom. I think that's a really important. I'm not saying we didn't evolve. We don't have lungs and organs and bone marrow and all the rest. I'm not saying that. We are materially animals. Yeah. But we have another dimension to us, which is glimpsed through, I think, religion, art, the numinous, those aspects that make us this weird kind of hybrid. And I think that's also part of the continual struggle of being a human being, is being, having that capacity to reach to the heavens, having the capacity to be spiritual, and at the same time having to live in a body that does respond to the world in an animal way, and with those animal instincts as well. That's why I keep going on about socialization and the need for socialization, because if left to our animal instincts, if unsocialized, then you get the horrible behavior, the rapes, the violence, etc. That's evidence of a lack of socialization. When people say, Western society is to blame for toxic masculinity, for sexual aggression, etc. No, that it's the opposite. That's a failure of society. That's evidence that society has failed, and I think they're looking at it backwards.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about, you didn't use the word homophobia, but you talk about the innate disgust that the majority of sexual creatures will have towards minority sexualities, and that I'm just wondering that as a test case on how to use reason, rationality, and persuasion to modulate that disgust in a proper way. What we see, what has happened with the so-called pride movement, is that it's got hijacked and turned from a vehicle of, I guess, acceptance to a vehicle of normalization and celebration. And so that there was something that I would assume you think it went off the rails somehow, but it used the social persuasive tactics to do so.
Wasn't very persuasive, was it? I mean, this is the point. You're never going to persuade someone that, twerking in front of a child, getting naked in front of a child, overt fetishistic displays when there are families present. You're never going to persuade anyone that that's a good thing for society. Very few people.
Why do so many parents bring their children to their?
Yes, they do. They do because but not so many. I mean, let's be honest.
Okay.
The majority of people don't approve of that behavior, and I mean people on the left as well. I don't think this is. I think obviously when you see the videos and you see the parents there, and you think it looks like that's all you're seeing, but what you're not seeing is that many, many more people who wouldn't dream of taking their children to something like that. I mean, I'm really concerned about this because, we've seen, haven't we, support for gay rights plummeting in the US, support for gay marriage plummeting. There are now 5 states, I think, trying to seek to overturn the same-sex marriage. All of this is happening because this initialism, LGBTQIA plus, or whatever the hell that phenomena is being conflated with gay people. Whereas actually, as we know, it's antithetical to gay people. It's antithetical to their rights. And so people see the TQ plus, the fetishistic displays, the inappropriate drag performances in front of children. And by the way, I need to draw a distinction. Drag is an adult education. It's adult art form, adult entertainment. I have nothing against drag for adults or drag performances. I have very much something against sexualized performances for children. I think that's deeply disordered. And what I would say is that
how do you make that decision or distinction? Like, on what basis is that value rest? What does it rest on?
On what basis does that value rest? Precisely because what I was talking about before, I believe in a very, very strict delineation between adult autonomy and freedom in childhood. I don't think, for instance, curbing a child's freedom of speech. I've been a teacher. When I'm in a class, if some child is swearing their head off, I have a responsibility, because part of my job is socialization. I have a responsibility to say, no, you cannot do that. Now, if an adult, as I said before, was standing on a street corner swearing his head off, I don't have that right to say, you cannot do that. I simply walk away and say, I'm not interested, right? So that is a clear delineation. Part of the socialization of children is not exposing them to inappropriate sexual activity, to curate, in other words, the kind of material they see, because children do require protection. They do require socialization. If you're exposing them to things that they cannot possibly comprehend. And this is why I genuinely have a problem with the gender identity movement, because they've got this idea that there is such a thing as a sexed soul. They're teaching children, very, very young children, about an idea that about a belief system. You may as well teach them about Marxism or Confucianism or whatever it might be. They're not. It's indoctrination, not education. In other words, that's the.
But there has to be some amount of indoctrination, because you use the word appropriate. That word appropriate comes from some sort of value.
That goes back to exactly what you were saying before about that debate about where does the value come from? For some people it comes from Christianity, etc. And I will go back to my view of those eternal truths, those universal truths that I think we can all fix on. But this is a bigger conversation. But I think coming back to your, and I don't have all the answers for that, but of course, or to anything. But let's go back to that point, because I was halfway through that point, which I think was a really key one, about this notion of gay rights, and about this notion that a belief system has suddenly materialized in society that says homosexuality does not exist. This is a thing that has turned up and said, being same-sex attracted is not a thing. You are same-gendered attracted or opposite-gendered attracted. You're attracted to people's souls, not their bodies, which completely negates the entire foundation of gay rights, which is the notion that there is always a minority within any given society that is predisposed sexually to be attracted to members of their own sex, and that always exists. And if you say that that doesn't exist, you effectively eliminate homosexuality and gay rights. And we've seen the impact of that. We've seen men in lesbian dating events. We've seen men on lesbian dating sites. Grindr now, by all accounts, is full of young women who have been told that they are men. It's also full, by the way, of straight men who are now opportunistically going on to Grindr to pull women who think they're men, because they're very vulnerable and it's very easy to get them into bed. So there's all sorts of dark. You've even got Grindr, which is, let's face it, a gay sex hookup app, shaming gay men for being gay. On their website, on Grindr's website, it says you can filter out by various, what height, age, etc. You can't filter out by gender identity. You can filter by sex. But if you say that you're interested in men, there will be women who think they're men in that category, because they say it's transphobic. And so they are shaming this company that's made its money off gay.
Are they shaming, or are they just regulating? They can't force people to hook up. But they say you can't diss people.
It's not dissing.
But whatever you guys say.
What they're saying is that you should be including women in your dating pool. Imagine anyone saying to a gay man, "How dare you're a bigot if you don't consider women within your dating pool." I mean, that to come from an app that made money off gay men's sex drives is quite astonishing. So, and that's the kind of comment you would get from a homophobe back in the 80s. You need to just try women. Just try women. You probably haven't found the right girl yet. Grindr are now saying you probably haven't found the right girl yet. And that's just what homophobes used to say back in the 80s. Now, so what I'm saying is the TQ plus element of all of this initialism is, by definition, anti-gay. By definition, more fiercely homophobic than any Christian fundamentalist movement.
Why do you think that is? Why?
Well, when I was a kid at school, you couldn't say you were gay. You couldn't be out. I mean, you would have been beaten up in the playground. You would have been ruthlessly bullied. But what you wouldn't have had is the teachers and the politicians and the parents saying, "Oh, maybe we should have your dick cut off. Maybe we should fix you. Maybe you're in the wrong body because being gay is weird." That's why it's much more dangerous to grow up gay today than it was when I was a kid. And I never would have thought that would have been the case. But
was there a moment where it was at equilibrium, and can equilibrium exist?
Yeah, probably a little bit after I left school, insofar as, there was a kind of Goldilocks period, I think. I mean, I was pretty lucky insofar as an adult, no one cared. Like, I was living through that period, it wasn't, I mean, it's not true to say that I haven't experienced homophobic abuse or even physical abuse. I have, but that's just because of the I was coming into that, when I was a young man, sort of between 18 22, you would still get the looks on the street if you held a guy's hand, or you would still get, and there were still people hanging out outside gay clubs to beat people up. That was still a thing. It was still a thing, and you just had to be a bit more wary. But then it kind of changed, and
so a certain amount of socialization worked, and then went off the rails.
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
A certain amount of socialization, people were trained on some level, or a meme appeared within liberal society, or UK and Britain, or USA and the UK, that it doesn't matter if somebody's gay. That doesn't really affect you.
I think we come back to this idea of social contracts and societal consensus that gets developed over time through very sort of complicated things. Because that's sort of what I'm talking about with this idea of liberalism, the idea of a cultivation of a social contract, which is an ever-evolving thing, right? And I don't like the idea of pinning it down to one thing or another, propaganda or whatever it might be, or the priests or the Christian right. I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think these social contracts are developed, and it is just the case, and I cannot obviously pinpoint how, but it's just the case when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, no one cared. Being gay was unremarkable. It was as unremarkable as being left-handed. It was mundane. It was, we were not victims, we were not, but something shifted again. So I think there was that kind of Goldilocks period. And during that time, my understanding, because I was a school teacher, remember, during that time, kids would be openly gay towards the end of my school teaching career, and it wasn't an issue. It wasn't a problem. Now then, something sort of shifted. The TQ plus stuff started. The gender identity stuff started. This, and in tandem with that, you also had the rise of the woke movement, which absolutely prioritized victimhood as a form of power, as a form of currency. And then all of a sudden, you have gay people saying, "I'm so oppressed because I'm gay. How dare you oppress me?" When there was no oppression, it wasn't there. It wasn't a thing. And so what they had to say was, we had equal rights in law. I'm not saying gay bashings didn't still happen. I'm not saying there wasn't violence against gay people because they were gay. That's always, like I say, that will always happen. There will always be psychopaths in society who do what they want. But what I was saying is that we reached that point where we were generally considered fine, and then there was this insistence that we must be victimized. And the way that they did that is to say that although we can't see evidence of victimization, it is buried within the power structures. That, of course, happened with race as well, critical race theory. So it is that kind of combination, I think, of the rise of the woke movement with its prioritization of victim culture, with this rise of a pseudo religious belief system in gender identity. And the two things were a disaster when they coincided. And it was particularly a disaster for gay rights. It was suddenly, and now, of course, there's another turn, which is that all of a sudden you've got people going back to this people on the right going back to this very, very reactionary idea that of being homosexual is degenerate, and they use that word. I've been called a sodomite and all sorts of things I've been piled on, but in a way that I know that hasn't ever gone away, and I know that with the sort of fundamentalist Christian groups that's always been there, but it's never been so prevalent. And I think it's a reaction against the TQ plus, the excesses of the woke movement, the excesses of gender ideologues, which are now being conflated in the mind of the Christian right, or the right more generally. I've had people say to me to my face, I spoke to a very lovely right-wing Christian man who was saying to me, now I've started to think, were we wrong to say that gay people should have equal rights, equal marriage? Did that open the floodgates to all of this other stuff? My point is, it's the opposite. All of this other stuff is anti-gay. It doesn't follow that by opening up an anti-gay thing and normalizing an anti-gay mentality in society, that gays are to blame. Gay people aren't to blame for an anti-gay movement. It's the opposite. If you look at the pride parades with all the fetishistic stuff, which remember, by the way, the majority of people on pride parades are straight. That's a really key thing. The majority of people in the LGBTQIA plus community are straight. There was that survey in America of young Christians between the age of 18 and 34, and it was, I think, roughly 40% identified as LGBTQ. Statistically, that means that the vast majority of those people are heterosexual. You had people like the singer Dannii Minogue saying she was a queer, and then when she was pushed on it, she said, "Oh, I wouldn't sleep with a woman. I've got a male partner." She just identifies as queer. Who's that woman? Cuomo's daughter, the guy. She came out as demisexual, and all that means is that you're attracted to people in a romantic way. You know, that to have a relationship you have to have an element of romance. So she came out as an old-fashioned heterosexual, and suddenly says, "Well, I'm part of this queer community. I'm oppressed. It's people identifying into victimhood because of the currency that it brings." So what I'm saying is, the LGBTQIA plus movement is not only anti-gay; it's a predominantly heterosexual movement. It's straight people with a kink.
Mm-hmm. So your book that you have to continually update until you just send it out there is about the ending of the woke movement. What do you think is ending? What do you mean by that? Like, is the cachet, the social cachet of being a victim is no longer valid currency? It's been inflated too much. Nobody can
What I mean is that the hegemony, if you like, if you want to use that terrible word, which by the way, a lot of people in England pronounce hegemony, and I know that, yeah, and American
aluminium hegemony.
I actually don't know which is right. You know, I knew a linguist who told me that it should be hegemony, even if you're in England. But then I've heard very, very intelligent people in England that say hegemony. It might be one of those things, you know, transatlantic
GIF
difference. Who GIF and GIF or whatever, or you know, or the Z. You know, like we would say colorize with an S, and you would say colorize with a Z. But then you would say Z, wouldn't you? So it gets very confusing. Although weirdly, the Z is actually an old-fashioned English way of doing it. Anyway, doesn't matter. Where was I? You see, you distracted me with linguistics.
Yeah.
What were we?
Look at that mind just kind of spin.
You did it.
I forgot too.
Don't blame me. What were we talking about?
The ending of woke.
Okay.
Like delegitimization of victimhood as social currency.
What I was saying is, this thing that happened rather rapidly and completely upended society, this cultural revolution, if you like, which the apotheosis of which is definitely the summer Black Lives Matter riots of 2020, and that's the sort of high point. It is in decline. There was that study in The Economist talking about how it rapidly came about around 2012, 2013. You know, all of the analysis of the kind of language that was used online. So things like white privilege and toxic.
Well, even in the New York Times, so that all spiked.
It all spiked, right? So we know, and we can all, you know, just experientially, we know that this thing started happening in the early 2010s. And this study in The Economist found that at its height, that it was at its most popular around 2020, and it's been in decline ever since, year on, year out. And we all sort of know this to be true. And I think, so whatever woke was, and I've gone out of my way to define it at length in my last book, in The New Puritans, I've got a chapter on it. So whatever we want to call that thing, is dying. And and we know this in the little things. I mean, look, every now and then you get an incredibly kind of egregious example of woke pushback, which, you know, it is like a cornered rat. It is like, they're really lashing out with extra ferocity now because it's dying. But then you also get the more telling news stories, like, for instance, the Jaguar commercial that came out last year, where you had those sort of epicene, gender fluid models, no cars in the advert, but, you know, just with those slogans like "think differently" and "delete ordinary," whatever the hell that means semantically, and it looked. And what was really interesting about the reaction is it wasn't like it used to be. You know, when that advert, it felt outdated. Weirdly, it felt old. It felt tired. It you know, and if that had come out in 2020, you would have had woke activists cheering on, saying this is brave and courageous and radical, even though it's completely conformist. And you would have also had the right getting outraged. You would have had tabloid articles about outrage. But actually, the reaction was far more it's just a bit boring. It's a bit old now. Like it felt. It's weird, isn't it, when stuff dates? But to date that quickly, it felt like a relic. Because clearly that advert had been developed during the height of wokeness and is coming out now. And the fact that it doesn't feel, you know, I mean, look, just the other day, just this week, an actor came out, a woman who's in a soap opera in the UK called Coronation Street. And she came out as non-binary. She's a woman in her late 50s, came out. You can't come out as non-binary. It's like coming out as a punk. You know, it's not an innate thing, is it? But but she said, "I'm non-binary. I want to be called they, them." And everyone was like, "Oh, really? Still?" Like it's not fashionable anymore. It's quite, you know, interesting that someone in her upper middle age who's doing it now. That trend has passed. And, you know, I've seen, you know, you've seen AOC take her pronouns off her bio, and Pete Buttigieg doing the same. Like, people just silently, gradually retreating from this mad thing. And, you know, it is absolutely clear to me that the end of woke is nigh.
Well, what's the fallout for that? Like,
Right. So
who gets
okay. That's what my book's about. That's what my book's about. Because I'm talking about a book that isn't even on pre-order sales now. I'm completely wasting. I should really have spoken to you when it was available to buy.
We can speak again. I enjoy our talks.
So do I. So let's do that. But the point of the book is what happens next. Is I see woke, as I'm sure you understand and know. I see woke as the latest manifestation of authoritarianism of our time, and I see the history of humankind, as being various pockets of these. There's an authoritarian impulse, I believe, an instinct within all of us, and it just manifests in different ways over time, on the left, on the right. Sometimes it manifests through social justice causes, sometimes through religion. It just comes from all sorts of areas. And this was just the latest iteration. What was new and perhaps unprecedented about this particular iteration is this was coming from people who claimed to be the underdogs and the victims, which you didn't. That's sort of a new thing. And it also made it harder to tackle because these were bullies who were claiming to being the bullied. But now that it's fading, what will happen? Well, what we're already seeing, as we know, the pendulum swings, and what we're already seeing is those who have objected to this identity-obsessed worldview are now cultivating their own identity-obsessed worldview to counter it. There are people saying, well, now that power structure is out of the way, let's instigate a new power structure. In other words, what I am talking about is authoritarianism is going to rear its head again, and it's going to be it's the natural order of things. And we see how this works. Back when I was a kid, the right-wing tabloids were the ones calling for books to be cancelled, films to be censored. Now it's the left-wing papers, it's the Guardian, New Statesman. Those are the ones that are supporting censorship and saying that art has the capacity to corrupt humankind. And now it'll go back to the right again, I think. I think you'll get a lot of, I've already seen it, a lot of right-wing commentators, edging back towards censorship, the kind of censorship that Mary Whitehouse advocated. She was a you may not know about her actually. She was a Christian anti-television campaigner of the 1960s and 70s, and she became very
British Tipper Gore, I guess, would be.
I don't know who that is. You see, we have
she was advocating parental advisory stamps on lyrics for.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, Mary Whitehouse went a bit further insofar as she was saying that the BBC ought to be promoting her worldview. She was in fact, the last ever case for blasphemy in the UK courts was because of Mary Whitehouse. She took Gay News, the magazine Gay News, to court for blasphemy.
Oh, okay.
They published a poem in which envisaged Jesus Christ in a sexual relationship with a Roman centurion. And it was very graphic. Terrible poem, by the way. If you read it, it's just bad poetry. Now, my response as a liberal is to say, criticize it for being a bad poem, right? Criticize the poem. Don't try and criminalize the person who wrote it. And I think that's happening now it always has to a degree. But for instance, there was a big controversy this week over a Netflix show called Adolescence. And a lot of right-wing commentators are angry about it because it doesn't represent the world as they would like it to be represented, insofar as it's about a young white boy who stabs a girl at school. And
that narrative is kind of disingenuous. You have to.
Why? It's a work of art. It's a creative work. It can be about whatever the person wants it to be.
Oh, okay.
If this was, I understand what you're saying. Is that obviously there is a greater problem with knife crime amongst black youth than there is amongst white youth. We know that's the case in London, but that doesn't mean that a creative can't make a film about a white kid who stabs someone. Like it's whether you perceive these creative things to be predominantly about spreading the message you want to be spread or interrogating the things that you want to interrogate. I agree that there is a problem in terms of TV commissioning insofar as things that go against that message are unlikely to get commissioned. I understand that complaint, and I agree that is a problem. For instance, if you wanted to write a drama about honor killing, about the problem of women being targeted within Islamic communities, the BBC are not going to commission that, right? So I get that that's an issue. But targeting creators because of the choices they made or because of that to me is a problem. Mary Whitehouse's idea was exactly that. She was like, we should be putting out TV programs that spread the message that I want to be spread. Hers was very similar to some of the woke complaints. She even had to go at a play. This was in the early 60s that depicted a homosexual man who ends up, I think, committing suicide. And she says, what does this do for homosexuals? How doesn't it make their lives harder? Doesn't it make it, she was coming from it from a, you know, she didn't approve of homosexuality, but she was a Christian who believed that we're all God's children, and she was saying that you know, that was her view. So her view was very much in line with the woke. But what I'm saying is that I think the arts are always the front line for would-be censors, and I think that can come from any side of the political spectrum. And one of the things I talk about in my new book is what will happen to the arts next. Where will the battleground be? It's often going to be cultural. You know, it's the targets of censorship are always the things that are disapproved of by those in power. The bishop's ban of 1599, which saw various satires burned in London.
Yeah.
You know, that was because the powerful didn't want to be criticized. That's why that happened.
Yeah, but when the entire power structure of education and media is bought into this thing that we ascribe the word woke to, and woke goes by the wayside, what happens to those institutions? How long does it take for them to catch up? And there can be no neutral institution when we're talking about culture. There can't.
That's the question. That's what's really interesting. You know, I think what we're seeing is this strange new phase in the culture war where, and I almost see it as a kind of equivalent to an old Henry James novel, insofar as we're having a very clear dividing line set up between America and Europe, between the old world and the new, which is of course the theme of most of his books. And you get this sense of, you know, J.D. Vance coming over and addressing the Munich Security Conference and telling them that European leaders, you've got a problem with free speech. You know, you've got an issue here. And in America, we're trying to do something about it. And the Europeans doubling down and going the other way. We've got a government in the UK that's pushing for as much censorship as possible, for prosecuting people for offensive memes, actually releasing rapists and violent criminals from prison to make space for people who've posted offensive memes.
And then making movies about white boys knifing people. And then making articles about toxic white masculinity.
But again, you're lumping like the government.
It's all a piece. The BBC is the government.
Oh, this wasn't BBC, and the government did not make that movie.
Oh, Netflix. Okay, yeah.
This is my point. Is that? And I agree that there's a problem in the arts industries. I've been banging on about it for an awful long time. Groupthink is really, really predominant, and the problem is that I think they will take longer to catch up. Right? I talked about this idea about the advertisers are catching up quicker because their pocketbook is informing their choices, right? So the Jaguar losing all that money, Bud Light losing all that money, it's, you know, they are going to catch up much quicker. The BBC won't. I think the BBC is captured to the degree that it may as well be disbanded at this point. I think it's salvageable. But I think the theatre industry, if you go to any theatre in London, most of them have gender neutral toilets. Now, I've been in 2 theatres in London where I heard a woman complaining about the fact that she's going in there and she's seeing men pissing everywhere. That it is not something that women ask for. It's not something that women want. And but you know, you see the lanyards, the Rayburn lanyard. The theatre is very captured. Comedy is very captured. TV is very captured. So all of the things you're saying, I 100% agree with.
If censorship is not the way, if bans aren't the way, but disbanding is, what's the difference between disbanding CNN and banning CNN?
Well, it's not a ban. You're talking. The BBC is very specific. The BBC is a state broadcaster where we are forced to pay into its coffers. Like, this is something that is meant to serve the population at large. In other words, it is a quango that is no longer fit for purpose, and you disband quangos that are no longer fit for purpose. It's not censorship.
Who does it? How do you do that? Like, is there a viable political path towards that?
Well, I should imagine it will become unviable itself, and it will naturally do so. They're going to try probably and go to a streaming service but it's not working. It's the government's responsibility to ensure that its government departments and quangos are not ideologically captured and only serving a particular proportion of the population. I mean, another example is the College of Policing, which trains police in England and Wales, and it's the College of Policing that implemented the idea of non-crime hate incidents without any mandate from the government. In fact, the government has told them repeatedly this is not lawful. A High Court said it wasn't lawful. You had successive Home Secretaries saying you have to stop recording and investigating non-crime. It's not your job. They ignored it. They fudged the language. But now we've got an authoritarian government in the form of Labour who are saying what they might do is they might just change the language, call it something else. We'll call it something else, but we've still got to keep a track on people's free speech. Anyway, the point I was trying to get to, perhaps inelegantly, was about this idea of what do you do when there are certain industries, there are certain areas of society that are lagging behind? In other words, the woke movement is dying. It's never enjoyed popular support, of course. I mean, there was a study by the More in Common initiative that showed that at its height in America, it only had 8% of the population behind it. This has always been a top-down imposed authoritarian movement imposed by the powerful on people, on a subdued population who didn't want it, right? That's always been the case, right? Which is why it can't last, ultimately why it won't last and why it's not last. Now, when it comes to the arts, they're not catching up, are they? And they're doubling down. We've seen with the Snow White stuff this week. We've seen with did you see this story this week about the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust? Because the other major institution in industry is museums, libraries.
Yeah.
All those who are curators of history and tradition, they are not catching up either. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is a charity that is responsible for the preservation of various properties in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon in the Midlands, which are connected to Shakespeare. Things like his birthplace, Anne Hathaway's cottage, his nephew and niece's house. All of those various properties, and they also have a large archival remit. They have various sort of artifacts connected to the bard. They were talking about they've now announced they're going to decolonize. They're going to decolonize their archival materials. They say that people need to be warned that Shakespeare's work contains sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. All of the usual boilerplate. And they're doing all of this stuff, just these stock phrases, and again, it's one of those things that feels tired. It feels outdated. It's like we're just getting over all this, and you're just going to keep. But they're going to keep going. Shakespeare, in particular, I think, any kind of cultural icon like that. He's the best playwright, the best writer that the English language has ever produced. He's also white. He's also male. Probably not heterosexual, but they can ignore that. And he's gonna be the continual target. In fact, the people who are most responsible for the preservation of his legacy, that is to say, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, the Globe Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, they're the worst. They're the ones that keep insisting how evil he is and how his work needs to be problematized. This is why all the productions at the Globe Theatre are so terrible, because they have this kind of awful ideological nonsense shoehorned in, so it just becomes unwatchable. They did a production of Romeo and Juliet where they had a suicide hotline projected up because they think this is just about mental health among teenagers, which means they're not really reading the play. I mean, they're free to interpret it however they want. You can interpret Shakespeare however the hell you want, but every single major theatre company and director is interpreting it in exactly the same way. It's so banal. They're all in lockstep. They think that all that Shakespeare was a white male, dead white male, who was promoting the interests of other white men. And therefore, we need to mangle his text. We need to mince it up into this insipid pulp to spoon feed the acolytes of social justice. That's what they believe. And it's so boring. It also means you're basically reading Shakespeare with blinkers on. It's like just reading his plays for just one thing. The reason why Shakespeare has never been surpassed as a writer is his sheer abundance and vitality. It is the fact that he's the only writer I know of who is able to think in so many different ways. His characters seem alive. They seem to come off the page. They seem to escape their creator. He knows how they think. He knows their psychology. Even the minor characters have an identifiable psychological way about them that is nothing to do with him. That's why we also know nothing about Shakespeare's opinions on anything at all, because you can't detect them from the plays, because every conceivable worldview is represented in those plays. And yet, these people, these activists, these ideologues want to reduce him to race, gender, sexuality, identity. He may as well just fall asleep. What's the point? So it doesn't surprise me that Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is doing it. It doesn't surprise me that the Globe Theatre has its annual anti-racist webinars. It doesn't surprise me that these people are not the very people who are in the worst position to interpret Shakespeare, to preserve his legacy, the vandals of Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare himself is far more interesting than any of his vandals, but his vandals are in charge of his legacy. That's a real problem. So then that comes back to your question is, at what point does that get resolved? You're dealing with predominantly upper middle class people within their bubbles who don't recognize that woke is dying, who don't see that, who are determined to hold on to it. And yet and it is going to be financial ultimately, probably. As I said, with advertising, it's a no-brainer. But when it comes to, the theatre, people aren't going to the theatre. People aren't going along to be lectured. Ticket sales are down. The art that they're producing is moribund. But it's ultimately Shakespeare will win out. Great art will win out because people will always return to the texts. I mean, I always say to people, I taught a course on Shakespeare's tragedies for the Peterson Academy. There's like 7 lectures I give, and that's a point that I emphasize throughout. I say, don't go and see Shakespeare being performed, because it's going to be mangled in this way that I've described. Read the texts. Just go back to the text. That's all you have to do. Don't worry about what critics are telling you about it. Don't tell you, the ones that say that Othello is about race. Yeah, it's partly about race. Race is an element. It's about a black man in a predominantly white culture, but it's not about race. Like his race isn't the most interesting thing about him, and nor is it the most salient thing about the play. It's a factor, right? And to shut yourself off to Shakespeare, if you're just reading, if you're just reading a play about what through one lens, then you're not really reading it at all. And that's why I'm so dispirited by what the woke movement has done for the arts. I also think because it has cultivated this scenario where artists can only be commissioned if they toe the line, no good art is being produced. None can be produced. Nothing is.
That's not necessarily true. We do have the internet.
Right. So exactly. So people are finding ways to circumvent the gatekeepers. Yeah. I think yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying there aren't people doing incredible work, but there is no, I think in any given generation, there are a couple of geniuses that emerge artistically. They depend upon the other artists that are doing their thing. And, I think all that is incredibly valuable. But I think, and I was thinking about this because I read a book by Victor Hugo. He wrote a book on Shakespeare. Well, he called it Shakespeare. It's actually only 10% of it is about Shakespeare. It's really about the notion of human artistic genius. And he estimates between 3 and 4 actual authentic artistic geniuses emerge every generation. And that chimed with me because it's sort of what I've been thinking. And where the figures like Mozart, the figures like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, they only come along few and far between, but they can only emerge when the conditions are right for them to emerge, when they have the patrons, when you have the church saying, come paint the Sistine Chapel and have your artistic freedom to do whatever you want. I mean, for God's sake, Michelangelo, the freedom that he had in the Sistine Chapel, he painted arguably erotic imagery, images that the church must have objected to. I mean, there was that, who was it? One of the bishops, was his name Biagio? Do you know about this? One of the bishops who was living at the Vatican, complained about the nudity in the Last Judgment. The one he did last, on the wall, on the side, not the ceiling, the one on the side. He complained about the nudity, and then so what Michelangelo did, he repainted the figure of Minos, who's this demon in the underworld, as the priest. He painted his features. He gave him big donkey's ears. He made him naked, and he had a snake biting on his genitals. What an incredible response to this attempt to shoehorn his art. Yeah. And the freedom. So the church may not have appreciated. They wouldn't have liked the fact that Michelangelo slept with men. They wouldn't have liked his worldview. But they understood great art, and they understood that great art is the conduit to the numinous that I was talking about earlier. They understood that. They understood that it was divinely inspired. And I fear that if you have a society that doesn't have patrons, where the rich don't support the arts, where the likes of Michelangelo and Da Vinci cannot be cultivated, these are people who might ultimately never realize they're artists even. The woke movement cannot produce those geniuses. You can produce creatives. Some people are doing some good work. I think I can very confidently say no artistic masterpiece has been or will be created in the woke era. I don't think it's possible. I don't think the conditions are right.
Well, it would have happened by now, and it would forestall woke's demise had it.
It can't, because the great artistic achievement of that kind demands non-conformity. And we're living in a culture where you can't get commissioned unless you're a conformist. So I just don't think, it can happen. So, and that bothers me. If I think of all the things that we are missing, if you think about how enriched we are culturally by the arts. And so therefore I also get very nervous whenever I see attacks on the arts, even if it's art I don't like, when I see it coming from the right as well. I mean, it goes throughout history. I mean, if we take literature, let's take literature. You don't mind me delving in a bit on this, do you?
Please, I'm here for it.
Well,
literature.
Let's think about the notion of obscenity, which is something that nobody can seem to define, even though it is defined in law, but not well. It seems to be something that is stirred by disgust. What does that mean? It's completely subjective. Whenever there have been prosecutions for obscenity, no one has ever been able to pin down what it is that they're objecting to, other than a feeling of, I don't like that. think of the things that have been subject to obscenity trials. James Joyce's Ulysses, which, you know, now looking back looks relatively tame. I mean, there's that. I've written about this. There's a moment in Ulysses where he's masturbating on the beach while he's looking at those girls, but the way that it's written almost strikes us as euphemistic in today's idea. But it was censored. It was censored by the Postal Service in America. It was being published in installments, you know, the way that Dickens used to, and it was the post office that started seizing these various editions of Ulysses, and it was the publisher who was put on trial. And then you have Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was published in the late 1920s in Florence by Pino Orleoli, the independent publisher. So that caused no problem at all. It's only when Penguin Books republished it in the UK in 1960, was it 60? In the 60s anyway. That's when it became a big storm. That's when it went to trial, and that's where you got that famous line where the prosecutor said, "Is this something that you would want your wife or your servants to read?" Right? It's just something that he considered to be disgusting, vulgar, because it used words like fuck and cunt. It automatically could not be literature. But of course, Lady Chatterley's Lover, I mean, what's ironic about that is D.H. Lawrence hated smut and hated the idea of the degradation of sex. And he was trying through that book to elevate sex to something that was pure and spiritual and noble. Whether he succeeded or not is very much a matter of opinion. But obscene? I don't think so. Similarly, Last Exit to Brooklyn, another one that was put on trial. I think a couple of copies were actually burned in the UK. Tropic of Cancer, the Henry Miller novel, which was defended very robustly and persuasively by George Orwell. All of these, not every now and then you get this book. We had the same with American Psycho, the Bret Easton Ellis thing. Although I don't think there were attempts to ban that. Oh, well, there were people calling for the ban, but I don't think it ever reached a court of law. But it's very interesting. So I get very defensive about even bad art that I think is tasteless and just awful.
Well,
like that.
Let's put this a little to the test, because now that every teenager has a portal to infinite porn in their pocket,
yeah,
does that not warrant? Does that not evoke your statutory virtues?
Because, I mean, I think you asked this question before in a different way, because do you remember when I was talking about the distinction that I clearly draw between childhood and adulthood, right? So same goes for pornography. I mean, I think, you know, children should not be, excuse me, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have some of my passion fruit water.
Oh.
You know, and the reason my throat's a bit dry, not my iced wine, and this is, because I've been listening to Bobby Kennedy, so I know I shouldn't be taking chemicals and stuff. But this is just water infused with a hint of passion fruit.
Yeah,
just a hint, a suggestion, just a ghost of a passion fruit, if you will. And it's delicious. I'm not getting money off that company, by the way. I just wanted to, but yes. So I do believe
the right-wing soda jab was that.
I'm in it for the money from the water people.
Crab blocks.
I think absolutely children should not have access to pornography, right? And I think
so that curtails somebody's freedom.
No, like I say, I gave the example of censoring speech in the classroom. I don't think the socialization of children is an example of curtailing their freedom. I think children have to have their freedoms curtailed, because in order to have freedom as an adult, in order to be an autonomous adult, you have to be effectively socialized. It just doesn't work. In other words, the curtailing of freedom of children is protecting their freedom in later life. That's what that's doing. And again,
but every drive to censorship has that at its core. The curtailing of freedom in order to preserve the quality of society.
Sure, but then we have to draw that distinction. But again, it comes back to this philosophical belief, whether you believe in a liberal society or not. We have to draw that distinction between the curtailing of freedom for children, which is in the interests of socializing them to a degree where they can have freedom, and the curtailing of freedom for adults who should, under a liberal system, have been socialized to the position where they can look after themselves and they don't need authority figures. I mean, this is actually very much a philosophical difference which cannot be resolved, insofar as I have a perception on this and you have a perception on this. There is no right answer here. There isn't a right answer.
Okay, but we still need to have an authority curtail access in this particular instance
for children.
For children. And how does one know who's holding the phone?
In the same way, I wouldn't give. Well, right, yeah. Those are big questions about how do you do that. I don't know in the digital age how you do that. It's it's far beyond my expertise. But it's the difference between,
but without doing that, look at what's happening to our young folk. Look at the paucity of relationships between young men and young women. The whole gender stuff is fueled by early access to pornography in large part.
But that doesn't justify the censorship of what adults consume. I mean, I don't think you're in disagreement with me. You're talking about curtailing what children consume, which I agree with. And I don't think that's connected to, because you were making a connection between that and the censorship of art and the censorship of obscenity. But I'm not calling for the censorship of even pornography. I'm calling for, I mean, I certainly wouldn't like to see illegal pornography, people involved in non-consensual activity. Of course, that's already criminal. But I don't believe in the censorship of what consenting adults choose to do, but I do believe that children shouldn't be exposed to it. I don't think that's a controversial point, and I don't think it's inconsistent either in the form of liberalism that I'm espousing and outlining.
Why are children different?
Because they are not fully developed, socialized. Their frontal lobes aren't developed. They're not fully autonomous. They are dependent. They require. I think this is a fairly obvious point, isn't it? Like, you can't.
We say it's obvious, but the whole reason that we have a discussion like this is to uncover why.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious because they're underdeveloped. They're not adults. They haven't got a full capacity for individual choice. They haven't got the experience. They haven't got the intelligence. There's all sorts of reasons why children require protection. And also, if you don't make any effort to socialize the young, then you have ultimately you have an adult population who can't make choices. Who can't be free. Well, how is that liberal? That's the opposite of liberal, I mean, I'm struggling to see how I take the point you're making, but I struggle to see how the censorship of obscenity in art, or if you're against the censorship of obscenity in art, that you're somehow for child access to pornography. I don't see the connection.
The infrastructure for limiting information has to be erected in order to protect children. So you therefore have to create a device that can be used to potentially curtail adult access to, let's just say.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, but those should be different structures. And there are people who have actually successfully implemented those different structures. For instance, which was the state that recently implemented a pornography ban? You have to enter your detail. In other words, you have to prove you're an adult before you have access to pornography. I mean, that's one example of a structure that is put into place to enable adults to make their own choice, but to prevent children from accessing.
But then the government now knows that knows what you're consuming because you've entered.
Different issue. That's a different issue. That's an issue of whether you trust the government to have your data on file, right? Which I imagine you don't, right? But luckily, you would never do anything so degrading as look at pornography. So there's not an issue that will affect you, Benjamin Boyce.
For sure, yeah. And
your purity is something you're known for. You are known for your
what I do in my own bedroom, right?
Yeah. Well, all I meant by that is that you are, reading books.
Yeah,
that's all I meant.
Well, I tease that out because I'm not so sure that that society is served well by unlimited pornography. And so there is some level of censorship and some level of authority that might be beneficial to society. And going all the way and saying no authority should be over anybody's actions, even consenting adults, that there should be absolutely no guardrails around society just doesn't seem plausible to me. In the absence of a society that can police itself, which that's where the liberalism probably we meet, is that we need adults that have been inculcated to a certain level of virtue, but that the systems that do that aren't doing that. Like our public education system is not doing it. It's doing the opposite. Our media is not doing it. It's doing the opposite.
Yeah, but what you're arguing effectively is because liberalism hasn't been implemented, we need to blame liberalism. If the principles of liberalism are...
I'm not sure that we're worthy of liberalism if we can't keep... Because
we're not applying its principles. As I say, if we had a sound education system, you can't... we have an education system that is not liberal, is not in the liberal tradition. And that's why it's not working. If we do have the guardrails that you describe, we have the rule of law, we have socialization through education. These are the guardrails that I'm talking about.
I think we continually have to return to them. And the basis is not strong enough for liberalism.
No one is suggesting that we have a free-for-all on pornography that includes illegal activity. No one is suggesting that we completely get rid of the rule of law, or like no one's making this claim. The solution that you're suggesting is that we should have some kind of moral parameters on artistic creation to do with the subjective notion of taste, and that those should be applied in society by figures of authority. Well, how do you trust those figures of authority to apply it? Well, they will apply it according to their own perceptions of taste. I'll give you an example of that. The Conservative government about 10 years ago implemented a law against certain pornographic depictions, including...
Oh, yeah. It was like they had to measure the labia or something like that.
Yeah, or like face sitting, caning, like... Basically, it amounted to stuff we don't like, right? Now, the problem is that's not I mean, how is that enforceable? It's utterly ridiculous. So what you will always have because no one could define obscenity. Yeah. It will always just come back down to things that I don't like. And what you will do then is you will create clearly a black market for the worst kinds of pornography, the most extreme. I mean, if anything, we know from the history of censorship that it exacerbates the problem you're trying to get rid of every time. So I don't think that that's the right way to do it. And also, what else gets caught in that dragnet? You know, does the Bible get caught in that dragnet? Does the great works of art that I've described? Would we like to, if we gave the censors their way, if the Lady Chatterley trial had gone the other way, would we have Ulysses? Would we have D.H. Lawrence? I'm more interested in the principle and the precedent than any individual artwork that any individual politician just happens to find distasteful.
But I'm just trying to get to I guess going back to that, is it Madison quote about this Constitution is for a moral and upright people. Liberalism can only function with a moral and upright people who are socialized, as you put it, and people who know the difference between what is appropriate and inappropriate. And without self-governance, it doesn't work. And so liberalism in it of itself does not have those virtues or parameters in it. It's for people who bring those virtues and parameters.
No, it can work, because liberalism, as I say, yes, self-governance is an important aspect of that. It's something that Milton talked about a lot. I mean, I would say that Paradise Lost is all about that principle, insofar as Adam and Eve have to choose for themselves to eat the forbidden fruit, right? He makes that absolutely clear. He even has one of the archangels turn up to explain to them that you had this choice and yet you did. Free will is the key there. The absolutely self-governance, that's what he means by liberty. He means virtuous self-regulation. But at the same time, in a liberal system, that is operating in tandem with the social construct, with contract, the idea of this consensus that we reach collectively. Mm-hmm. It doesn't depend on everyone having the same mindset, because what it means is you are at liberty to violate the social contract as long as you're not violating the rights of others. But if you do so, because of the social contract we've cultivated, you face the consequences of that. It is disadvantageous to yourself. And this is one way that we deal with the inevitability of human flaws and failings. We need to know, don't we, as a society, when we have failed to reach the ideal, on the understanding that we will fail to reach the ideal. I mean, this was a major problem with the gay community. This was a major problem with the fact that living in the shadows, censoring, banning, if you like, the very fact of being homosexual, created the conditions whereby it was driven underground, where license reigned over liberty, where people ended up doing absolutely whatever they wanted, where monogamy became an unknown thing virtually within the gay community. And that has a kind of catch-22, because then people start saying, well, gay people are innately promiscuous, right? No, you created a society where this was an outlandish thing on the fringes. You made that, when straight men and gay men have the same sexual appetites, but when a straight man cheats on his wife, he knows he's violated some kind of ideal. It doesn't stop him doing it necessarily. It does. Obviously, adultery is very, very common, but he knows that he's violated some kind of social contract that we cultivated over many, many centuries. Mm-hmm. Gay men didn't know that. They didn't have that. That hadn't been cultivated for them, and therefore it was a completely different. They didn't know what was the ideal there. What was the ideal within gay culture? Was it the bathhouses that were depicted by Larry Kramer and Edmund White? Was that the ideal? Was that the failure of the ideal? I'm paraphrasing, by the way, from a lecture by John Boswell, who gave a fantastic talk about this, called Rediscovering Gay History, which is really worth reading. But I'm saying that's why I feel that the cultivation of that consensus doesn't happen immediately. It happens in an inchmeal way over many, many years. It happens bit by bit. It is cultivated. And I mistrust anything that attempts to fix something in society like a panacea just overnight, because normally that's authoritarianism. Normally it's a set of rules we are imposing now, right? And the woke do this all the time. So the woke came along and said, we are now all going to say that they and them is a singular pronoun and everyone has to go along with that. And they tried to impose that. But because of the very gradual, long-term evolution of language, it never caught on. Because to our ear, our training, they as a singular pronoun rings as incoherent. And you have to reset your reading faculties every time you come across it. It doesn't work. And so it's never caught on. Very, very few people can go along with it. In fact, when you read an article where the media are, calling Sam Smith they or them, the reading of it soon becomes incoherent. Even the people who ascribe to it get lost. So that's why it's never caught on, because the imposition of that kind of thing was never going to be accepted on a societal level under this system whereby we gradually edge towards something where we can all agree. That I suppose is the philosophical idea I'm espousing. That's where I'm trying to get us towards, and that's why I also mistrust obscenity laws. And moreover, they don't work. Say we could all agree that face sitting was appalling, was beyond the pale, and must never ever happen, right? And you shut it down and you say that can never be depicted or written about or thought about. You think it's going away? Of course, it's not going away.
Yeah. I'm just saying, without the continual cultivation and socialization of a people by itself, it fails. And liberalism doesn't have within itself the principles that it seeks to allow people to.
Yes, and you keep
voluntarily.
But you keep returning to this idea of an external authority that must provide the guidelines, and that's the very thing.
Where did I say that? I say without. I'm just saying that society can't.
I might have misread you, but I thought your critique of liberalism was that it doesn't provide a set of aspirations or a set of rules towards which we can strive in the way that the Judeo-Christian tradition does.
Well, it doesn't have. Liberalism is a negative ideology. It just says don't harm and don't enforce anything on somebody else. But that only works in a high trust society when people can generally predict how other people are going to behave. Exactly. So it doesn't have a positive view.
Exactly, which is why I don't think it's an ideology at all. But I think it also does, absolutely right. It only works in a society where its principles are applied.
Yeah. Well, where principles wherein it can function survive. It can't. It can say don't do bodily harm to people, but it can't say how to treat, how to respect or how to be a noble person. It has no bearing on what good art is. It just says don't try to ban bad art, but it has no positive value. It relies entirely on a socialized populace. Yes, so that's why you have to suspend your liberal principles when it comes to children, because children aren't able to make those informed decisions about what is good and what.
You're not suspending your liberal principles when it comes to children. You're applying them. That's my point. The whole point of the idea of the cultivation of the social contract and the freedom that we need as adults.
Yeah, but the social contract doesn't come from liberalism. Liberalism is a fact of a social contract that works.
No, but again,
it cultivates trust.
I think you're getting I think it's a chicken and egg thing. I think you're getting it backwards insofar as I think those kind of high trust societies are produced when you embrace the liberal system. And they also are the very conditions which enable the liberal system to perpetuate. Yeah. So therefore, exactly. So that's why.
But liberalism hasn't always existed. It came out of a very particular society, your society, and I guess mine. Anglo-Saxon.
I think
Scottish.
I completely agree.
British Christian.
I think authoritarianism is the norm. I've said this more times than I care to remember. I think absolutely you're right. Liberalism is an aberration, and it is a beautiful and precious aberration. And it doesn't come naturally to us, and that's why it has to be fought for, cultivated. Mm-hmm. The case has to be routinely made.
And can it defend this? Can it defend the values? Can it defend itself against wokeness? Can it defend itself against authoritarianism? Can it defend itself from the degeneration that's inherent within human society without continual maintenance?
Well, that's the question. I mean, I think it's the very best defense. I think the very best defense against woke is the liberal system, is to say, you don't get to decide for other people how they ought to behave and the things they ought to say. You don't get to decide that.
Even if it destroys society. That's suicide. That's societal suicide.
Why would defeating wokeness destroy society?
No, I'm saying without being able to judge how people behave, society has no guardrails.
I'm not calling for again, the guardrails of liberalism are built into the rule of law and education and socialization. Those are the guardrails. I'm not calling for a free-for-all. I'm not calling for anarchy. I'm not calling for license. I'm talking about this notion that when it comes to authoritarian movements such as wokeness, the best solution is not to impose a different kind of authoritarianism. I don't think that's the way that you solve it. I think the liberal system is what defeats it. And also, it just works. It just works. When it's implemented, when it's done properly, it just creates better conditions, and it always has.
At what point was liberalism properly implemented? Are we talking about 1995?
Not wholly implemented and not properly implemented. What I mean by that is when many of its chief tenets are embraced, results happen. When the civil rights luminaries did their thing, when it was black rights, when it was the 1960s onwards, when we're talking about Martin Luther King, there were tangible results that came out of all of these groups that all had freedom of speech just baked into their DNA, freedom as the fundamental principle, which included the freedom of their detractors to speak. And that's why they made so much progress. And that's also why the woke movement hasn't made progress. It's scared a lot of people. It's intimidated a lot of people into compliance. But look, it's dying, and it's dying pretty much as quickly as it was birthed. I mean, this is a very short-lived revolution. And I think the reason that it's so short-lived is because ultimately we have built up a liberal consensus, whether we acknowledge it or not. We do. People are generally good. People are generally, they want to live in high-trust societies. They want to trust and look out for each other. They want
why the need for socialization if people are naturally just going to converge on a appropriate behavior?
I'm not saying they naturally converge on that. I'm not saying that it comes to them in a kind of Rousseauian way in childhood that you needn't bother with education. I'm saying the opposite, saying that comes about because of the socialization.
I guess we're not meeting, because I think that liberalism doesn't have within it the values that allow for liberalism to function at scale for society. People have to bring a certain value set to liberalism in order for liberalism to work, and that's why it worked, because people had already adopted a system where it could work. Like that's why it comes from the Anglo-Saxon Christian tradition.
That those values are baked into it. The value of the right to behave, believe, and act in the way that you do.
Yeah, but it doesn't have the value of like sacrifice. Of not doing something that you want to do because it's not good for society.
Oh, 100% it does. Absolutely it does.
Really?
Yes, because at the heart of what I'm describing in terms of liberalism is social responsibility, is looking out for other people, is exactly those things that I've described. It's exactly what Milton talks about. That you don't, what the liberal does not want is a complete free-for-all. It's the opposite of what they want. I think what's happening here is we've just got very different conceptions of what liberalism means.
What I am attempting to do is not to argue with you with what I believe, but to present to your liberal point of view certain strains and questions that I've found in the post-liberal dissident right point of view.
I agree.
And trying to test them and trying to solve this particular chicken and egg problem.
And I welcome that, but the problem I suppose I have with it is that all of the critiques seem to be criticizing something that I'm not advancing.
Okay. Well, yeah. So insofar as clarifications being made about that, but I just don't see how liberalism can't actually confess to its coercive nature.
Let me explain.
Inherent within it.
I suppose my point is simply that I can't defend a version of liberalism within which collective social responsibility is not an aspect, because I can't defend that because that's not something I believe in. Okay, good. So but I think that the dissident right would take a view against that brand of liberalism, but they should talk to someone who believes that, not me.
Okay, well, we got to the point where you say that there are positive values, and social responsibility is one of those values.
I think it's key.
Not behaving in certain ways that you would ascertain through rational means are deleterious to society is not a liberal principle.
It's not a liberal.
How do you gain that moral insight on what's good and what's not?
That's I don't know. That's a massive question.
So it's not found within liberalism. It's
not found any. I mean, if you want to, I haven't read a book that's told me what to think, and I don't think liberals have done that. I think what has happened is the conditions of liberalism have created this gradual move towards this consensus that gets built up over many, many years that creates precisely those conditions you're describing.
I think woke was an aberration from liberalism.
Sorry?
Well, the wokeness, because another critique of liberalism is that it inevitably leads to communism, to wokeness, because it needs to have people all bought into a certain social contract, which then has to be enforced in order for it to.
Okay. I'm just going to say it again.
To work.
Liberalism doesn't depend on everyone buying into the social contract. Liberalism depends upon the existence of a social contract that has been reached by consensus that people are at liberty to disregard if they wish to. The examples of communism and wokeism cannot be blamed on liberalism because they are the antithesis of it. I think it comes back to what we mean by a liberal system, and I would urge people to read Milton on this. Read his Areopagitica. Areopagitica, which is his defense of freedom. And specifically, well, I can give you the context for that book.
Yeah, actually, I think it's really important to go down to the foundations of liberalism, and I trust Milton more than I would trust Mill. I would trust a storyteller more than a philosopher,
well,
just because.
And again, because we're all human beings, we've all got our. I mean, neither of them, Milton or Mill, would have extended this generosity to Catholics, for instance. So let's
exactly right.
Yeah, but let's leave that aside. In fact, Milton wrote this anti-censorship tract, and then a few years later became a censor for the state. But it doesn't matter, right? Okay, but because built in with what they're saying is we're all flawed, we're all imperfectible. Okay, fine.
Okay.
The background to it is this, and I'm probably going to fudge this. Let me do my best. I'm not a historian. Let me do my best. Milton, of course. He wrote the state were attempting to implement censorship. They wanted all published materials to be passed by the state in advance of publication. That was the bill that they passed. Now, I can't remember when that was. It would have been something like 1652, 1653. People are going to Google that and berate me for it, but I think it's around that time. And what happened was Milton responded to this by writing this kind of counterblast. And he was saying, his whole argument is you have to let truth and falsehood grapple. Because when you let them grapple openly, in other words, the marketplace of ideas, truth will out, truth will win. He talks about how the idea of destroying books is to destroy, he sees it as even more pernicious than destroying a human body, because you're destroying the human spirit, the human soul, you're destroying knowledge. He talks about, the Areopagitica, by the way, comes from the speech by, the Areopagiticus, the mound where the judiciary used to meet at the Parthenon and the Acropolis. Still there, in Greece, in Athens. And the Areopagiticus, I think, was a speech by Isocrates. I think it's Isocrates. And so he took the name. That's what it means. That's what the name comes from. That's what he's talking about. The idea of freedom and liberty and justice. And so, in short, the Areopagitica, which is not very long, it's about 50 or 60 pages, can be read in a couple of hours, is one of the most eloquent defense of this principle of liberty that I know, and he does outline better than I ever could a lot of these ideas which, by the way, haven't been fulfilled. It's also very interesting. He talks about it's a very passing reference, but he talks about meeting Galileo as a young man. So he did the kind of grand tour. Milton went around Europe, and at that time, Galileo was an old man. He'd gone blind. He was under house arrest in Tuscany, and he was because he said that he subscribed to the Copernican theory that the Earth went around the sun, not the other way around. And of course, he was effectively prosecuted for hate speech. He was confined to his house. Sun hate.
Well, Earth hate.
He was almost executed.
Geophobia.
Terrorphobia, maybe. And he, and And it's really interesting because Milton ended up in much the same. I mean, Milton was a young man when he met Galileo, but then fast forward to his, he was disgraced. He picked the wrong side, didn't he, in the Civil War? He wasn't buried in Westminster Abbey and Poets' Corner with Spencer and all the others. He got
or George Floyd.
He wasn't martyred or he wasn't sanctified or canonized is probably the better word. He ended up blind, same as Galileo. I mentioned in my last book, which is very fanciful, but I thought it might be like when he met Galileo, it's kind of a premonition of what he would become: ostracized, hated by the state, blind, old. But all of this just draws us back to this idea of what we now call hate speech, but the importance of allowing truth and falsehood to be aired, and not to be afraid of people getting things wrong, and not to censor, not to curb liberty, because whenever it happens, the opposite occurs. Insofar as the thing you try to suppress flourishes, festers, multiplies, and reemerges in a far less palatable manifestation, shall we say?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you. I agree with you. I just don't see how. I don't see young people. I see young people gravitating towards, let's say, authority, because they want nobility, and they're seeing just a loss of authority, or like the mismanagement of authority, like a supposed right-wing backlash from young American males, which we can kind of see in the data, is a pining for. There's a high form of that can end up being perverted into a low form of power, right? And I don't see how, without a renewal to certain virtues and values that reach higher than just a non-harm principle, that there's certain thirsts within a generation that was wrecked by COVID authoritarianism, wrecked by anti-white hatred or just the critical theory, just wrecked by these things. They're going to be looking for some sort of ascent, some path towards ascension. And that requires us to lay out and resurrect the roots of Western culture, and those roots precede liberalism. And I think liberalism, it's just not sufficient to our needs, especially with a generation that hasn't been educated or socialized in a way that they can achieve greatness, right? And so we can bring up the greatness, the great liberals of the past and stuff, but or even, was Shakespeare a liberal? Right?
We know nothing about what Shakespeare thought.
I know.
We know absolutely nothing. No, certainly you can find great, beautiful defenses of liberal values within his work, and you can also find defenses of tyranny within his work. I mean, if you want to look for it. I mean, look, Julius Caesar can be played either way. It can be played as a pro-populist piece, or it can be a pro-populist, anti-elitist piece, or the precise opposite. Who do you side with? Were the conspirators right to kill Julius Caesar? Were they wrong? Who's in the right? He never settles down. And just when you think he's settled down, he completely scuppers you. There's that point in Julius Caesar when, obviously, you have that amazing moment where Brutus gives his speech where he explains why he had to kill Caesar, not because he didn't love Caesar, but because he loved Rome more. And he gives this incredibly powerful speech to the plebeians, and everyone's on his side, and they're saying, yes, Brutus should be in charge, right? And then Mark Antony turns up, and he does that very famous speech, which you will probably know by heart: "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," right? And what's brilliant about that, I mean, rhetorically, it is so deft. For a start, Mark Antony is kind of varying the language of Brutus. It's in verse for another thing. So the Brutus speech is in prose, and then all of a sudden we get this variation of the same themes in verse. So it's got a kind of innate elegance and power to it, potency. And he is able, within under 150 lines, to turn that crowd entirely the other way. And then you start thinking, okay, the populists were right. Julius Caesar was the common man's advocate, and these elitists who wanted things their own way got rid of him, killed him. This is why this story is continually used like when they did that production in New York in 2017 of Donald Trump as Julius Caesar in the play, and Donald Trump was stabbed. It's because they saw it as an anti-Caesar play, an anti-populist play. But of course, the complete reverse could be the case. And then you get the plebeians rioting because of what Mark Antony has said.
Yeah.
And then maybe you're on their side for a bit. And then what happens? Cinna the poet turns up. Now, there was a conspirator called Cinna. One of the conspirators who killed Caesar was called Cinna. And then a poet called Cinna turns up, says, I'm on my way to Caesar's funeral because he's a friend of mine, someone I beloved. And they say, it's Cinna. Kill him. And he says, no, I'm not the same Cinna. I'm a Cinna the poet. I'm the poet. Cinna, Cinna. I'm the poet. And they say, well, tear him up for his bad verses then. Kill him for being a bad poet then. It doesn't matter. And so all of a sudden, any kind of affiliation you have with the crowd and the populists, it dissipates because suddenly you realize this is just a mob who are seized by bloodlust. So Shakespeare never lets you get pinned down. There's a really famous production of Coriolanus that was in the 1930s in France, where you had Republicans turning up and the opposite. You had both sides of the political spectrum thinking that the play was an endorsement of their worldview, to the extent that there were riots, to the extent that they started fistfights within the theatre. Every night this happened throughout the run. Just people fighting and screaming. It spilled out. People were killed. The military came in because each side could see their own worldview reflected in the text. Shakespeare just doesn't pin it down. Yeah. So to say that he's a liberal, I don't know. But yeah, so you've got me on my pet topic there. So that's not really.
Yeah. What does that speak? I mean, if you were to learn something from Shakespeare, is it not the ability to give yourself over to a point of view without losing the other points of view, or what would it be like? And is that what kind of virtue of spirit is it that you're able to see all these different points of view? Does that mean that you don't have a point of view?
No, of course not. But what an incredible gift to be able to not to embody a worldview or that is entirely alien to your own. And I think what Shakespeare does better than anyone is give us that insight. He now allows us to get into the mind. Take Macbeth. You're in the mind of a man who has committed regicide. And you're in the mind of this man who knows it is wrong to do so, but feels that he has no other choice. In other words, we have the dramatization of a world without free will, and it's terrifying. And you sense Macbeth spiraling and working against his own interests. But because of the great innovation of Shakespeare's plays, which is, of course, the soliloquies, because of that insight within his mind, because he is talking to you about his own thought process and even trying to rationalize and understand himself through the act of speaking, you are able to you feel you are Macbeth. You feel that you could do that maybe in certain circumstances. It's a good production of Macbeth is a very strange and disorienting experience. But similarly with Iago, how can this be the case? I mean, he's created in Iago this vacuum of morality. Of all the characters in literature, he is surely the most devoid of righteousness. He is, and yet he's not a caricatured devil from a morality play, because he's a thinking, feeling, breathing human being. And even though his entire philosophy is destruction, he will completely obliterate the most precious thing in the world, which is love. He will take a loving couple and he will turn them against each other to the point of murder, and he will do it for no other reason than that is what he does. And he has these incredible soliloquies where he's trying to justify his own actions, and he starts to lie to himself by himself when he's talking, and then he starts to believe his own lies. So powerful is his own rhetoric, he convinces himself of his own lies. And we hear all this in these extraordinary soliloquies. So even this, what you might call a cipher of evil, an embodiment of evil, suddenly is psychologically complex. And then you're left at the end with a sense of why. The big question is why. At the end of Othello asks the question that all of us are thinking. There's various little motives. He was passed over for promotion. He starts saying he thinks Othello may have slept with his wife, even though he knows that's not true. He starts saying that he's in love with Desdemona. There's even a sense that he's in love with Othello, because there's a kind of weird homoerotic fantasy at one point. There's all of these various motives that are raised and then dropped. There's no sense of why. And then at the end, when he's wounded, captured, and Othello says, he asks a question, he says, ask him why. Why has he destroyed me? Why has he done this? Demand this demi-devil, why he hath thus ensnared my soul and body. And what does Iago say? Probably the most chilling line in literature. He says, demand me nothing. What you know, you know. And that's it. You can't know. You can't know. He's led us in and he's explored all this incredible interior, a psychological train of thought, and you still end up not you both understanding and completely finding me incomprehensible. And I can't think of another writer that's done that. And I can't think of another writer that has been able to perceive the world in these disparate ways. And I think, because I'm going off on one, to summarize, I think A.L. Rouse, who was a great literary critic, he put it this way. He wrote a biography of Shakespeare, which was apparently quite controversial at the time, in the 60s. And he said that Shakespeare sees through everyone equally. That's how he puts it. In other words, just as Aristophanes would mock everyone, rich and poor, men, women, whoever the hell they were, gods, mortal men, Shakespeare does. So what Aristophanes does for comedy, Shakespeare does for drama. He sees through everyone. He's skeptical about everyone. He doesn't write morality plays. It's not goodies and baddies. It's not Disney. It's not Tolkien.
What do you mean by skeptical?
As in, what I mean is
distance there.
Well, it's that thing about seeing through everyone equally. In other words, he sees their flaws, he sees their contradictions. He doesn't attempt to flatten out those contradictions for the sake of a dramatic narrative. He embraces the complexity. I mean, goodness, like a character like Hamlet. The reason why you can watch and read Hamlet a million times and still get something new out of it every time is because it is not resolved. There are so many things that this weird philosopher thrown into the middle of a traditional revenge tragedy where he doesn't belong, who endlessly reflects on his own actions and by doing so delays them, who is capable of kindness and cruelty in equal measure, who is capable of deception and truth. You can't. In other words, he's a living, breathing human character, and because we're human beings, we're never readily quantifiable or comprehensible.
Yeah.
And that's Shakespeare's gift.
Yeah.
No, I don't think any other writer comes close to that. Certainly no other writer that I've encountered.
I do believe that authoritarianism is a flattening of the human spirit, and that liberalism properly contextualized within a value system that can support high trust and the pursuit of nobility and hierarchy and respect for authority allows for people to become complex. It allows for the expression of very complex things.
Can I suggest some reading for you? No,
that's fine.
No. Just
You're
because
my teacher, Andrew Doyle.
No, I'm not. It's just because I've just written about this in my book, and I think it dovetails very well with what you're saying. That's why I'm mentioning it, because I'm talking about freedom to behave as you want with a sense of social responsibility, and that's my view of liberalism. Yeah. But I also like what you're saying about the striving towards nobility, that we need something higher. This of course accounts for the popularity of Jordan Peterson, and even, if you like, Andrew Tate, right? This lurching after, or this desire for something higher than yourself. And the thing I want to suggest is one of the great liberal thinkers, who is Martin Luther King, who I believe was a liberal through and through. And I know that a lot of the Black Lives Matter activists have tried to say he absolutely wasn't. He clearly was. Yeah. And it's one of his speeches. He gave a speech about the three-dimensional man. And this is just a few pages long. I would really urge people to read it. And I think it really dovetails with it might even be the resolution between what I'm saying in terms of my form of liberalism and what you're saying, because he talks about the three-dimensional man. He says what you need in order to be free is the length, breadth, and height. That's what he's talking about. And he says that the length of life is freedom of conscience and freedom of belief, the right to do whatever you want, self-governance, right? That's the length of a good life. And then he talks about the breadth of a life, and the breadth, he's going out. He's talking about the community. He's talking about social responsibility. He's talking about love for your fellow man. That's the breadth. So you have the length, you have the breadth, but then you have the height. And he says the height of the good life is the thing you're aspiring to, the higher truth, the thing that is above you, the thing that you might find in God, in tradition, all of those things that you're describing, which I find in the arts and in Shakespeare, And I think, and he's saying that a life that is devoid of one aspect of these three dimensions is not complete life. You need the length, you need the breadth, and you need the height. And I think for the kind of liberalism I'm talking about is in line with Martin Luther King's view of liberalism. And I think it also quite neatly encapsulates what you're describing there.
It's not a valueless, purely negative.
No, it's not.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
It's really worth reading. So, it's not well known, but it's really, really worth reading.
Andrew Doyle, we got to wrap up the conversation. I have to head out here. It's been way too long since we spoke. I can't even remember when, a year and a half.
Long time ago, yeah.
So thank you very much for your visitation. Does your book have a title?
Sorry?
Does your book have a title yet?
The End of Woke.
Oh, okay.
And there's an implied question mark there.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It's not a post-mortem, quite.
Well, there's an element of that too. I mean, it's funny because I thought when I wrote The New Puritans, which was 2022, I thought that was like, that's my last word on this. I'll never have to write about this. But think about everything that changed. And I was, for a while, I was thinking, should I do a new edition of The New Puritans with a new introduction to bring us up to date? And then I realized that's a whole other book. Oh my goodness. We didn't have the Cass Review, the Tavistock. You didn't have like the discrediting of Black Lives Matter, the Trump administration. It's seismic, and so this book is even longer than the other one because there was too much. It had to be a new book, So I'm hoping I never have to write about the culture war again after this. That's my thinking.
You'll have to go back to making culture, purely.
That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm working on a sitcom at the moment, and nice. I'm writing other things. And absolutely, you're right. I'm doing another series of lectures on Shakespeare for the Peterson Academy. That'll be on the comedies, and that'll be later this year. So yeah, absolutely, create and I think and reclaim those great luminaries of literature and the arts, which we seem to be determined to problematize in all sorts of ways. Let's restore the primacy of the arts.
And if you have to shill for La Croix soda to pay the bills, then we can accept that of you.
It's a delicious drink. Unbelievable. Passion fruit, that one.
Just a hint. Just a ghost. Andrew Doyle, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Benjamin. See you again.